Shanks did a thing. Blackbeard is about to do a thing, and the Straw Hats have now had a thing done to them. One Piece is pretty wild this week with all the things. And I mean, nobody ever expected Lego to be a major plot point in the series ever, but here we are. To start with the cover story though, Detective Yamato is kind of on the missing people's case, although it's more that Yamato keeps incidentally hearing about missing people. However, what's most notable about this page to me is that I'm almost certain that this is the exact same spot that Luffy, Zoro, Tama, and Kiku were sitting in while we were in Okobore Town at the beginning of Wano. It might not be because I don't remember it being a soba store, but then again it's probably under new management now because Suru has packed up and moved to the flower capital. I think it would be a very solid landmark for Yamato to be coincidentally visiting though, because this would be where Tama started crying over how good the food was, and that then became Luffy's primary driving force to bring down Kaido. Something I've noticed about this cover story is the focus on food. Yamato was eating a pot of Odin before, now it's soba. Yamato is having a bento on the way out of the flower capital, and it's really heartwarming because for the vast majority of our time on Wano, everyone was starving. The idea of consuming food was an event meant to be cherished by those lucky enough to experience it. And more than anything else, the abundance of food and the happiness it brings is showing the effect that Luffy has had on this country. I also thought that the person Yamato was speaking to might be Some, because she has the same patent kimono, and Some was the geisha who was said by Queen to be the second most beautiful sim behind Komurasaki, and who, in the anime at the very least, had a bit of a crush on Sanji because he saved her pet rat Chuji and then fed her delicious soba. That makes so much sense actually, because Soma loved Sanji soba. And here she is now working in a soba store herself, having become a bit of a soba enthusiast. At least that's what I thought. Until I looked back and saw that Soma, I think, was already featured in the background of this cover story when Yamato was leaving the flower capital, because I think that's Chuji in her hand. It's weird though, because this new person has the same kimono, the same hairstyle, and is working in the soba store. So my only conclusion is what we have here is an imposter. Starting the chapter proper though, we have an explanation about what happened after Oimo and Kashi left Water 7, and I mean a while after they left Water 7, because this would have had to have happened extremely recently. However, I find this explanation a tiny bit contradictory. They state that they went to Little Garden because they couldn't wait to see Dory and Broggy again, fair enough feeling, but I'm not so sure about it because I quite vividly remember Oimo saying that so long as their bosses were still dueling, they couldn't go anywhere near Little Garden, as if it was part of the Elbaph Code of Honor. And I guess they changed their minds at some point, but it doesn't sound very, in the spirit of a mighty, proud Elbaph warrior. And Dory and Broggy were convinced to return to Elbaph to pick up weapons so they could continue their duel with said appropriate weapons, because the condition of achieving death would never be attained with bare fists alone, which, I don't know, to me again, doesn't sound very in the spirit of a warrior. It's not like it's the biggest issue in the world, but it doesn't feel like one of Oda's cleaner explanations. It's more like he had the idea for Dory and Broggy to come together on Egghead and then had to cobble together an explanation as to how that happened. However, what I do like is that their duel hasn't been settled just yet. Before we encountered them on Egghead Island, I'd always thought that One Piece would end with Dory and Broggy still fighting on Little Garden, and that this entire massive journey took place within a tiny fraction of their lives, going on to show the full scale of the One Piece world. And it does look like that's still going to happen to some degree. After the final war, after the dawn of the world, Dory and Broggy are just going to return and resume their eternal conflict. But in stark contrast to conflict, I'm never not going to love this, but Oda takes a couple of panels to show Kuma and Bonnie together during the party, and mate Kuma is 100% smiling. There's no ambiguity anymore. Last time, it was very subtle, like I could just be reading into his face what I wanted to read into it. But this time, Kuma is happier than I have ever seen him. Because in the past, there have been a couple of occasions where Kuma has smiled bigger than this, but he has never looked more content and genuinely happy. This man, however much is left of this man, is living what's left of his best life, traveling the world with Bonnie, which is accompanied by this wide panel of nothing but clear open sky and water. There are no barriers, there are no obstacles, there are no difficulties. Even in the new world, the weather is perfect. And this is pretty much the epitome of freedom that one can attain on this planet. And my god, do Kuma and Bonnie deserve that at the very least. Although I still can't help but feel that this isn't going to last, and we are heading for another tearful goodbye at some stage. Not this stage though. At this stage, what we've got is weird stuff happening, as this section also sets up for the end of the chapter by flagging the green fairy absinthe that can cause hallucinations. So if I'm reading this correctly, essentially what happened is everyone got drunk high, then half the crew was separated, and we now have the One Piece equivalent of the hangover happening. And we'll get to that because the end of the chapter, very intriguing again. Lego. But now, very excitingly, we finally have a conclusion to a 7-year-long story arc between Bartolomeo and Shanks. It is insane to think about how much real time has passed while this in-world event has been going on. Apparently, this only happened a month ago in the One Piece world, so our 7 years, their 1 month. It's been so long that Oda actually needed to recap the entire scenario, which was nice because we finally got a name of the island that Bartolomeo invaded, which at the moment is called Gartel Island. We'll see if the official agrees. And with what we know now about Shanks' Grand Fleet, looking back on the Bartolomeo cover story is quite funny. It makes a lot of sense. Because after defeating one dude and burning a single building, the entire island surrendered, and of course they did, because Shanks only takes the very weakest under his protection. Bartolomeo then declared war on the Red Hair Pirates by burning their Jolly Roger, although Oda didn't recap my favorite part of this event, which is that Bartolomeo then forced the entire town to buy Straw Hat merchandise, including pins and stickers. The dude sacked this island not with raw strength, but with non-consensual capitalism, the fiend. And right now my personal hope is that Shanks has actually kept one of these Luffy pins for himself, and he's keeping it in a special place, along with a collection of Luffy's bounty posters, newspaper articles, and all of the other things that makes him ever such a proud mentor. Now, speaking of proud, Bartolomeo, he was completely obliterated in this chapter, and I could not be more proud of him. The scene with the poison was brilliant, and watching Bartolomeo not only refuse to poison Luffy, but also willing to ingest the vial that was meant for Luffy is one of my favorite character moments of this year. In many ways, Bartolomeo was extremely immature, which he also demonstrates later on by calling Shanks rather soft and naive, not truly understanding the situation he was in and his impending doom. But when it came down to it, as is the title of the chapter, Bartolomeo took responsibility for his actions. He knew he messed up and took the punishment on himself in order to spare his crew and to save Luffy from the potential wrath of Shanks, which is the thing that Eustace Kid did not do. He continued to run his crew into emperor after emperor and has taken no responsibility ever. So if Bartolomeo wasn't already a fan favorite, he would be after this, but I think this has cemented Bartolomeo in that Bon Clay status. Because I swear, Bartolomeo is more loyal to Luffy than some of the Straw Hats have been at times. And I have to say, during this whole section, Shanks has some of the weirdest facial expressions I think I've ever seen on him, particularly this one after Bartolomeo drank the poison. It's such a bizarre face. And I think that this is Shanks coming to terms with the fact that yes, Luffy does have this wonderful support base, ready and willing to take him all the way across the finish line of destiny, but also the distinct disappointment that Luffy's support base is such a weirdo. It might just be me, but there's a tangible air of disgust in Shanks' expression. Like when Bartolomeo appeared during the Corridor Coliseum battles and disgusted all of his opponents. But the Red Hair Pirates, mate, they are such a menace. Because as the Barto Club is sailing away, Yasopp takes aim and blows up their entire ship. So aside from creating Usopp, this is easily the greatest and one of the only things that Yasopp has ever done. And it's amazing because guns generally don't do this sort of thing in One Piece. In fact, they're usually portrayed as quite powerless and cowardly. So I wonder if Usopp has more in common with Yasopp than just DNA, because whatever this man fired has to be some sort of specialty round to take out an entire ship in just one small shot. And this is, of course, the second time that the Red Hair Pirates have now done this, sinking ships and destroying semi-beloved crews. Is that just going to be their signature from now until the end of One Piece, plowing ahead through all of our favorite characters? Because the Barto Club are now facing the same fate as the Kid Pirates. They've been decimated. The going Luffy Senpai is completely gone. And that actually hits quite hard, because in One Piece, the symbolism of ships is very important. In a world where your freedom, as we just discussed with Kuma and Bonnie, freedom is the open seas, the ship is your dream. If you lose that, you are out. No more freedom for you, sir. And the Barto Club now makes 3 prominent pirate crews that have lost that right. They'll definitely survive. I don't think anyone is naive enough to think that the Barto Club are dead, and I imagine that they'll eventually hitch a ride with another faction of the Grand Fleet. That or the Straw Hat Grand Fleet will have their own flagship built at some point, which would remove the need for the individual ships, perhaps with an even bigger and more post-time skip Luffy figurehead. But what I really would have loved to have seen is how Shanks or the other Red Hair Pirates got past Bartolomeo's barrier abilities, because that was a power that stopped even Kozuki Oden back when the fruit was being used by Old Man Semimaru. But then cutting to Hachinosu, Blackbeard, he's finally returned, and there are a lot of great gags happening here. My favorite is that they've put bandages and band-aids on the actual skull itself of the island being controlled by Pizarro, and Blackbeard is scolding him in the same sort of way that the Straw Hats get angry at Luffy whenever he does something stupid. And we've also got Sanwan Wolf trying to fix the town but causing more damage in the process. And after having read this part, I don't think I've ever loved the Blackbeard Pirates more than this, because in this section they almost seem like the protagonists, because we're just getting to see them casually hang out and interact. And they aren't really all that different from the Straw Hats. Just another band of morons with big dreams and the will to make those dreams a reality. Very terrible dreams, I'm sure, but still, dreams. I think in most shonen series, the author would be afraid to give the main antagonist this much comic relief out of the fear that it would undermine their scary presence as villains. But I do really appreciate what Oda does with the Blackbeard Pirates, because eventually they are going to have to combat Luffy's ridiculousness, which is now his literal power source. And to do that, they're gonna need to bring their own wackiness to the table here. Fight ridiculous with absurd, and also the other way around. This chapter does also confirm that Garp is alive and currently being held by all of the chains in the universe to contain him. There's nothing too unexpected there, but what is interesting is that this might be sowing some seeds of chaos within the Blackbeard Pirates. Because Marshall D. Teach, he is not happy with anyone except for Kuzan. You know, that guy that none of the other crew members trust. It might not turn out this way, but I can imagine that there may be some jealousy and plotting due to Kuzan becoming the captain's favorite. And honestly, they'd be very right to do so. If there's any element that's going to bring them down at the moment, it is the Marine Admiral bomb that they have installed within their crew. In this chapter, Kuzan does say that he was going for the kill with Garp, and I don't, not believe him. It definitely could be a lie, but whatever his mission is, it would be far easier to earn everyone's trust if he did kill Garp. So I think that Kuzan may have actually been going for it, but I could be wrong. And I like this next plot point because it rhymes, but we have Lafitte with Umit, a very big development that I don't think we're going to comprehend the magnitude of until we see Lafitte's next steps. From what I gather, the Revolutionary Army is relentlessly attacking Umit's shipyard, which contains a lot of supplies bound for Marjois, which are not getting there. And Umit, in case you've forgotten, he came up during the Egghead Island arc as well, because his shipping company was seen delivering materials to Egghead Island for Vegapunk to construct the lab. And we've actually seen him way in the past. He's the underworld emperor who specializes in shipping and has clients from all across the ideological spectrum. In fact, I'd be surprised if the Revolutionary Army themselves haven't used Umit's services in the past, because he's the man you go to transport large quantity of goods or even bads very stealthily. And seeing Lafitte at this shipyard means that he's probably either there to sabotage or acquire Umit's services. The former because Umit could be supplying any given target of Blackbeard at the moment, like say Shanks, and then force him into an awkward position when supplies aren't getting to where the Shanks needs them to be. Or the goal is to supply the Blackbeard Pirates themselves for whatever upcoming plan they have. In this chapter, we have flagged that there's a large force ready and waiting on Hachinosu, but they might not have the ships required to set sail with that full force. But alright, we're here now. So the end of this chapter is real trippy for a fair few reasons. This is definitely not how I expected Elbaph to begin. And if anything, this feels extremely similar to the start of an anime filler arc. When the Straw Hats are on their way to the next canon island, in this case Elbaph, but along the way something just weird happens to kick them off course for a couple of days, make them fight dugongs or something. And that's what this hallucination absinthe feels like. Like I'm watching the anime and Nami has now woken up in a bizarre Lego filler arc, except it's in the manga. So I think this is actually the start of Elbaph. At the moment, Nami has woken up in Viking attire, although it actually reminds me a lot of the Beast Pirates outfits that everyone briefly wore on Onigashima. The obvious strange thing is that she appears to have woken up in a Lego room. This isn't something that looks like Lego. If you look at the floor, it is just Lego. And I guess that Lego does originate from Denmark, so it is still in keeping with Elbaph's Scandinavian vibes. And my guess is that Nami, as well as the other missing Straw Hats, have been taken by giant children and put into their Lego playhouse or play dungeon, play mansion, whatever it turns out to be. Or given the idea that Prince Loki could actually be considered a child by giant standards of age, this could be a fun way to bring him into the mix as early as possible. I'm not sure though, because I would have imagined that Loki is on Elbaph himself, although I guess there's nothing to say that this part of the Straw Hats aren't currently on Elbaph. They could have been taken there, while the others were not. But if they're not on Elbaph, then I think they're still definitely somewhere within Warland, which is the greater area containing Elbaph and potentially a series of other inhabited giant islands as well. And it has been pointed out to me that Warland could consist of 9 islands, each of which corresponding to one of the 9 realms in Norse mythology. So we could have a short stop before Elbaph, which isn't unheard of. It would be like how we briefly stopped at the train station before moving on to Water 7, or maybe even a short Longland style adventure before hitting Elbaph. I would say that latter seems unlikely though, because Oda has really been trying to streamline One Piece lately. But at the same time, I could easily see him going, mates, I want to draw a Lego house this week, so put all of our plans on hold. I'm doing that instead. And then it takes us 10 chapters to deal with whatever crazy idea popped into his imagination. What I love about this situation though is that it feels incredibly nostalgic, because the Straw Hats that are missing are the original 6: Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Usopp, Sanji, and Chopper, which I think is also why this is giving me such strong filler vibes, because that early era of One Piece was when many of the full filler arcs took place in the anime, and then from around Frankie onwards what they did was they inbuilt the filler into the canon a lot more. But also, this original 6 have shockingly never really had an adventure together, because before Chopper we recruited Vivi, and immediately after Vivi decided to stay on Alabasta was when Robin joined. So we've never actually had an adventure with just these classic 6 Straw Hats. And this is the part of One Piece that I find most exciting. The beginning of arcs and the promise of stepping into the unknown. Because the lore drops, the action, the reveals, and the silhouettes, my god, the silhouettes, they're all amazing, but they are all secondary to adventure. Again, the idea of stepping into the unknown and discovering a whole new world that was not previously thought possible. This is what One Piece gets to do at the start of almost every arc, before the plot inevitably takes command and speeds up the journey. So I'm really looking forward to just kicking back and enjoying some classic One Piece adventure for a few weeks. Because realistically, this might actually be the last time this happens. I don't know how many other islands after Elbaph are going to have the luxury of this sort of setup. It's very hard to imagine Laugh Tale and the final war playing out like this. So with that in mind, let us begin the last great adventure of One Piece. I would imagine that Blackbeard needs Luffy to hypnotize Pudding to read the poneglyphs. Not sure if it would work or if Blackbeard can even read them to some extent on his own. That is a very good point. Obviously, even if she awakened her abilities, Charlotte Pudding was never going to willingly read the poneglyphs of Blackbeard. However, they don't really need her to because they have a hypnotist on the crew. This is very easy to forget because it is such a brief line, but Lafitte was a major factor in the Paramount War because he hypnotized the Marine Guards into opening the gates of justice, which allowed the Blackbeard pirates to access the battlefield, kill Whitebeard, and go on to change the world into the one we currently live in. This is something that I frequently forget about. But of course, that is why Blackbeard is so confident with Pudding. All he needs is the mechanism to read the poneglyphs. He doesn't need consent to read them. Lafitte can handle the rest. And while we're on this topic, I've just thought of the potential idea that Lafitte may have hypnotized everyone at the Warlord meeting at Marijois, and that may be how Blackbeard was given the Warlord position. Because sure, Blackbeard, he proves himself by capturing Ace, but Marshal D. Teach himself at the time was a complete no-name with no bounty at all. Exactly the not what we want of a Warlord. So why would you give the position to him? Unless maybe the idea was incepted into your mind brain by a hypnotist. And so now that Lafitte is in Umit Shipyard, he could be hypnotizing any number of people to be doing any number of things, which I'm sure is the exact brand of frustratingly vague insight that you all come to this channel for. But it's true, he could be hypnotizing people to take ships and cargo back to Hachinosu, but he could also be planting Blackbeard's sleeper agents, ones that are going to sail all throughout the world and activate when Lafitte triggers them. Possibilities with his power are quite endless. Moria officially escaped. I feel like that got missed and will actually be important in the future. Mate, it is definitely going to be important. Moria and Perona escaped from Hachinosu off screen, and look, as for what they do next, I think that this may have been accidentally spoiled by Oda. In the recent batch of Vivia cards, Buggy's card contains Oda's original sketch of Cross Guild, and while a lot of it is a scribbly mess, one thing that we can very clearly make out is that Perona was supposed to be part of it, which makes sense because she could have tagged along with Mihawk, but that may still be the plan. I mean, where else do Moria and Perona have to go? Given Perona's relationship with Mihawk, she would see him as the best path to safety, and so Gecko Moria could end up joining Cross Guild, which would be massive as that would make 4 former Warlords of the Sea combining their powers and maybe even setting up for more former Warlords to join. Remembering that all Warlords are now former Warlords, and they all need somewhere to go. And what I would love most about Moria joining is that it would almost turn Cross Guild into a support group for Warlords who have been beaten by Luffy, because Moria would be joining good friends Crocodile and Buggy. And really, these three have so much in common that I've convinced myself that I really need to see this alliance happen now. And hey, maybe Perona could make some of her trademark cat sangria, and Cross Guild can have their own hangover arc alongside the Straw Hats currently on Elbaph. Although apparently during her time on Kurogane Island, Mihawk did most of the actual cooking, and while everyone thinks that Mihawk is set to face Zoro at the end of the series, this could also be setting up for a potential battle with Sanji. Sanji. Bato Club will rise again. The Going Luffy was destroyed, but the 1000 Nika is just on the horizon. Exactly. What happened here is the Bato Club equivalent of what happened to the Straw Hats on Sabadi. They were separated by Kuma, then they did a bit of a time skip, and they returned different, very different. And the Going Luffy Senpai, as phenomenal of a vessel as it was still stuck in the pre-time skip era. For the Bato Club to evolve, I think they need a new vessel which reflects Luffy currently. And if anything, this is a huge opportunity to command the global Luffy fandom with a Gear 5th inspired figurehead. I really wanted to see Bartolomeo fight though. Not because I'm desperate for more punch-fighty action on screen, but because I just wanted to see more of his creative homage moves. And come to think of it, I also would have loved to see his reaction to Jinbei joining the crew. That would have been massive news, and I do feel a bit robbed that I wasn't able to geek out with Bartolomeo about that. In the end, Bartolomeo is a criminally underutilized character, and I do say this about a lot of characters, but I would willingly follow an entire manga series about One Piece just from Bartolomeo's perspective. I'm convinced Oda is on a shadow campaign to slowly take out all memorable pirate ships so that he has less to draw when the final war begins. Maybe it's a request from his assistants to lessen their inevitable workload during the final war, because I highly doubt that Oda does a lot of the pirate ship drawing himself these days. He does design them, of course, but they are too detailed and too intricate, and that's the kind of work that assistants are paid to do. Now that she is reunited with her dad, Bonnie isn't using her power to be grown up anymore. She got her childhood back. That is a very sweet way of putting it. Bonnie no longer feels like she needs to overcompensate and be an adult because she feels safe with her father now. And not just him either, because the real travesty of my former video is that I missed this the first time around in the chapter, and I'm ever so annoyed because it is so adorable. But when half the crew disappeared, there is a panel of Bonnie holding on to Jinbei's Jinbei, because yes, the type of clothing he wears is also his name. But I love this panel because Jinbei is such a good crew dad, and Bonnie immediately recognizes him as the safest person to stand next to. Really, at this point, the crew have kind of adopted Bonnie. Through fateful circumstances, they've ended up with a child, like how the Roger Pirates ended up with Shanks and also probably Buggy. And I'm still really not sure where Bonnie goes from here. At the moment, she still seems like more of a Saga refugee than a Straw Hat, fulfilling more of a Kinemon role. But here's an idea. She could very potentially find a comfortable home on Elbaph. Now that she can activate a Nika future, Bonnie can actually become a giant and could fit in quite well with giant society, with the unfortunate exception of their winter solstice fasting period. Shanks casually destroying ships with his crew, especially now when the world is drowning, is indirectly evil. It's definitely a much harsher fate with what we know now than when Shanks did it to Kid. I'm not sure if I'd use the word evil though, because we've known what Shanks has been all about since chapter 1. When that bandit pointed a gun at him and Shanks said that, mate, guns are not for threatening. Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates are very no nonsense. And what Bartolomeo did was effectively point a gun at Shanks' empire, and guns not for threatening. So I feel bad for Bartolomeo, but it's either Shanks destroys the Bato Club or he puts every territory under his protection in danger. The Red Hair Pirates need that no-nonsense reputation more so than the other emperors, because the Red Hair Pirates deliberately claim and defend the weaker territories. It's not like Kaido claiming Wano, because good luck getting there, and I wish you even more luck trying to deal with the insanely powerful locals, or even Big Mom claiming Fishman Island, because no, it's not the most powerful, but it's extremely hard to get to and much easier to defend as a result. But Shanks' islands are just basic, easy to reach pirate farms. Wide open territory ready to be taken by any minor New World crew. So he really needs that reputation to protect them. His Jolly Roger practically needs to exude its own haki. And given that haki can apparently be imbued into knots and stuff, it's not out of the question to think that Jolly Rogers could have that installed into them as well. So I've also been thinking about the poison, and in a twisted way, this could have been Shanks offering Bartolomeo mercy, giving him a way out while saving face, but also not hurting Luffy because the poison was fake. But then Bartolomeo eagerly drank it, and after that happened, everyone knew, all right, I guess we just got to blow these boys up, and we've done everything we can. You'd think Nami would be a tad more put off by passing out drunk than waking up having been disrobed and had someone else's clothes shoved onto her. I'm not actually sure that Nami realizes that she's dressed differently just yet. She's only just woken up, and the giant Lego is commanding most of her attention at the moment, understandably so. Something that concerns me a bit more is that Nami has an extremely high alcohol tolerance, and in fact, she was identified by Oda as the third strongest drinker of the crew, behind Zoro in second place and Jinbei in first place. Insert your own drink like a fish joke here, I am too lazy to do it for you. But all three of them completely blacked out. At least we assume they blacked out. We don't know about Zoro yet. And it's not just them, but the giants who would assumedly have an even higher tolerance to this absinthe. They blacked out as well. And at this stage, I'm thinking that even though it was flagged that the absinthe can cause hallucinations, that someone may have spiked everyone's drinks with something else, and that this is all part of some weird plan, perhaps by Loki or a Loki loyalist. Because the key thing at the moment is that no one has hallucinated. They blacked out, which is very different. Although someone could be hallucinating. While a Lego room does make sense if Nami is stuck within the toy house of some sort of giant child, it could be equally as possible that she's hallucinating the Lego room as well as her outfit. I don't know if it's very likely, but what we do have is Chekhov's hallucination juice. You can't mention that the drink has this effect and then not show the effect. But another reason why I think there's something else happening here is because I doubt that Bonnie was also drinking the absinthe and blacked out. She was with Kuma when everyone else was partying, and whilst underage drinking has never really been a taboo in One Piece, I do still have my doubts that a 12-year-old was sculling absinthe. So whatever's happening here may not have been the drink at all. It could have been some other power, and everyone else is now conveniently blaming the absinthe. And spiking the absinthe could be a nice callback to what happened during Little Garden, when Baroque Works sabotaged the alcohol given to Dory. So maybe after this, the giant should just learn a bit of a lesson to not drink whenever the Straw Hats are around. Bad things happen. I think Loki has taken the Straw Hats because he became infatuated with Nami's wanted poster. And to win her over, he built her a castle out of Lego blocks. It's a nice way to combine the Loki, Lola, and Nami connections. It's not impossible, but I will say that I really hope this isn't the case. Because we've already played out a very similar scenario on Thriller Bark, which was also connected to Lola. So I guess this could be a way to bring in that love triangle. Actually, it's not a love triangle, more of a square, right? Loki loved Lola, Lola's zombie, loved Absalom, Absalom loved Nami, and Nami doesn't want anything to do with any of this, so it is a very misshapen love square. Again, I really hope not though, because the Nami infatuation plot is a bit too played out in One Piece, not just during Thriller Bark, but Movie 2 was also based on Nami infatuation, and it was even a major plot point of one of the stage shows. And also, we've already got a similar thing going on with Emu and Vivi, so I'm not hugely keen to dive into another one. I was also going to say that if Loki did want to do that, then Nami would be in a wedding dress, but then again, who knows what the people of Warland wear to their formal occasions? Probably battle gear. And part of me also wants to believe that Loki isn't an Absalom-like character, and that he genuinely saw something in Lola, and isn't just trying to marry every woman he comes across. Quick question. What was the time gap between Shanks nuking Kid and the Red Hair Pirates destroying Barto's group? In universe, of course. So as far as the known timeline goes, there has only been 1 day between these events. Egghead Island took place across 2 days, with the Straw Hats arriving and dealing with York on the first night, and then on day 2, the siege and the Egghead incident took place. Whilst this was happening, Shanks beat Eustace Kid on Elbaph during day 1, and has now dealt with Bartolomeo on day 2. I have to say, I'm a bit surprised that it's taken Shanks this long to get around to Bartolomeo though, because Barto attacked his territory a month ago, so what was Shanks doing this entire time? A month is a very long time. What we also know is that Shanks sailed past Wano on March 24th, because it was stated to be 7 days after the raid on Onigashima, which we know is March 17th, and that's when the Red Hair Pirates decided to deal with Bartolomeo, but that was at least 2 weeks ago now. So again, what took the Red Hair Pirates such a very long time to liberate their island from Bartolomeo's grasp? And also, what was Bartolomeo still doing on the island? Had he just been squatting there for a month? I would have thought that he'd moved on to be a bit of a prick elsewhere. Why is it that everyone thought Barto was on the ship? It was his crew that got blown away, hence why Barto said they just left us behind. Right, so I've seen this comment a lot, and for some reason there's a misconception with this chapter. Some people swear to me that Bartolomeo was not on the ship when he was blown up, but he definitely was. I think the confusion comes from the line, wow, they just left us be, with some people interpreting that as the Barto Club abandoning Bartolomeo, but it's referring to the Red Hair Pirates allowing the whole crew to leave, aka letting them all be. And also, I don't know how people miss this, but the speech bubble that's saying all of the speech is coming from the ship, so Bartolomeo was definitely on board. Did Yamato always carry a sword with the Kanabo, or am I oblivious? It is the second one. But you're definitely not the only one. A lot of people have forgotten about this sword. But this was given to Yamato earlier in the cover story by Kinemon. This sword belonged to Yasu, and Yamato's whole pilgrimage right now is leading to a shrine in Hakamai in order to lay this sword to rest. The shrine itself is actually called the Enma Enma Shrine. Not so much in reference to the blade Enma, but Enma in general, the king of the underworld. So it seems like this might be an important ritual in having Yasu judged by Enma to present an offering to the shrine. I'm not entirely sure, but the whole idea is that this pilgrimage needs to be completed on behalf of Yasu. So that's why Yamato has this sword, and it might even get stolen at some point during the cover story to turn that into a bit of a subplot to deal with as well. I am so tired of arcs starting with a crew split up. I guess it has been about 27 years of that now. And it's really difficult to think of an arc off the top of my head where the crew don't immediately split up. They're quite rare. At the moment, I can only think of Syrup Village and Long Ring Longland. But then again, splitting up the crew is part of the core fabric of One Piece. In fact, splitting the crew up at the beginning of an arc dates all the way back to Orange Town. At the start here, Luffy and Zoro got separated by a big old bird. So the Straw Hats were being separated for arcs ever since the crew achieved the bare minimum number of members to constitute the meaning of the word separation. I do think it's more noticeable post-time skip, mainly because we so rarely get any moments with the entire crew together anymore. But splitting them up is almost essential. Especially this late in the game, it is so difficult to create drama with an Emperor of the Sea and his full force. These guys just beat the Beast Pirates. They just survived the 5 Elders, a Marine Admiral, and a Busticle. So to create any kind of interesting drama in the story, you need to nerf them somehow. Otherwise, they would just plow through any challenges presented. Because this crew, they work so well as a cohesive unit. Each of them is flawed in a very, very specific way, but another crew member has the skill to make up for that flaw. The basic example would be Zoro lacking a sense of direction. But when he's with the rest of the crew, that is overcome because someone else can guide him. Meaning that to create drama involving Zoro, the most effective thing you can do is separate him from the crew. Because sure, he can beat anything that comes his way, but he cannot ever defeat the greater concept of navigation. Same sort of thing with Luffy. He lacks a general sense of awareness. So even though at this point of the story he is practically a god, he can still be very easily tricked and taken in without his crew around him. And also, it's just really difficult to write scenes where you have 10 protagonists all standing in the same area, each needing to give their own input and their own reactions to whatever's happening, and it would become boringly linear. Because if this was the case, then we would only get to explore one location at a time, instead of having different Straw Hat cells discovering different parts of these islands and meeting different people. We separate the crew so that they can all simultaneously discover different pieces of the story puzzle. And if we didn't, then we would have to go through and find those pieces one by one. And that would become very tiring. Like on Dressrosa, for example, Sanji found Viola, Luffy got involved in the Colosseum, Usopp and Robin discovered the Tontata tribe, Frankie met the Toy Soldier, etc. Everyone split up and they all found these pieces that eventually came together to tell a cohesive story. But now imagine what we would have to do if they didn't split up. We would have had to have the whole crew go and meet Viola, then the whole crew meets the Toy Soldier, and now the whole crew needs to discover the Tontata tribe, then the whole crew goes to the Colosseum, and we just have to keep doing that. And everything would feel so unbelievably slow, instead of playing out 4 or 5 different events in tandem. And the crew splitting up also gives us a chance to explore individual Straw Hat dynamics. Like how I'm quite excited to see the original 6 working together because that has never happened. We've always either had a Vivi or a Robin mixed in with this group. And I'm also hoping that this gives us a chance for the Robin, Frankie, Brook, and Jinbei team to shine in their own personal plot, because they're the 4 that usually get pushed most into the background during these sections. So for me personally, splitting up the crew gives us an exciting range of opportunities, and I cannot wait to see what becomes of them in the next chapter. Elbaph has finally, technically begun again. Technically, the beginning of the arc happened back in chapter 1126, but I don't accept that because this was the true spiritual beginning of an unbelievably colossal adventure. But to check in with our cover story first, what we've learned is that Mr. Inuarashi is now the daimyo of Kuri. And I guess that means that Inuarashi is now the one who's going to be living in that soon-to-be rebuilt Odin Castle. Very good, dog sir. And there's not a huge amount happening here, or so you'd think. It's a lot more talking about missing people, and hey, maybe Yamato will eventually decide to do something about that. Although it'd be pretty funny if Yamato was just like, not my problem, and kept moving on, but that probably won't happen, especially because we're running out of characters to sit down and eat with. So the vassals we still have yet to see in this cover story are Kiku, Raizo, and Kawamatsu, who are almost certainly the 3 daimyo of the 3 remaining regions. My prediction in this regard is that Kiku will be daimyo of Ringo, because that's where Izo was buried, and it would be nice to see Kiku at least visit her brother's grave, considering that she, for whatever reason, did not attend his burial during the actual Wano arc, which is a bit of a dick move if you ask me. Also, Kiku's epithet is Kikunojo of the Fallen Snow. So I think that the snow region, it makes a lot of sense for her. Continuing with that logic, I would say that Raizo is probably going to be the daimyo of Hakumai because his epithet is Raizo of the Mist, and Hakumai is perpetually covered in the slow-hanging mist, which leaves Kawamatsu with Udon, a place where he did spend 13 years of his life, but it was in prison, and I would hope that he's found slightly better living conditions since then. But the most interesting part of this cover page to me is the same thing that I've been saying for a while about the Yamato cover story, which is that it is all very food-focused. And that's not just because Yamato is a hungry Oden, it's because this is Oda showing us that Wano is healing. Before, everyone was starving, and now everyone can eat whatever they want, whenever they want, on whichever cover page they like. And all of the Wano characters are taking great advantage of this, and I do love the continuing idea that Yamato is eating with the vassals of Odin as the spawn of Kaido, showing that these two factions are joining forces to build a better Wano together. But look, Wano, that's in the past. Right now, Elbaph, that is the present. And this chapter gave us One Piece fans an event that we only get to experience once every 2 to 4 years these days, which is that we've officially kicked off a new arc with an adventure title. So if you're unaware, this has been an Oda staple for most of One Piece. Very appropriately, it started in chapter 115 to kick off Little Garden, which was called Little Garden of Adventure. And this adventure carried over to Drum Island in chapter 133, named Adventure in a Nameless Country, and then 162's Adventure in the Kingdom of Sand, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Every new arc starts with an adventure title. And after Little Garden, the only arc that doesn't start with this kind of title is Marineford, because there wasn't really an adventure to be had there. And here's something interesting that I don't quite know the answer to. But back when Wano officially kicked off with chapter 911, when it came out, it was titled A Great Adventure on the Land of Samurai. And this was a very big deal, because no title before this had ever used the word great or any adjective, no adjectives at all. And this gave us the sense that Wano was going to be something particularly big, which it was so big. And so this Elbaph chapter simply being called Adventure would imply that we're in for a more standard arc length, whatever standard means these days, I guess about 2 years, judging by the length of Dressrosa, Whole Cake Island, and most surprisingly of all, Egghead Island. But then I went back on the official translation of chapter 911 and my mind, it was a bit blown, because it just says Adventure in the Land of Samurai. And it really makes me wonder where the great part came from with the scans, and if this adjective was perhaps something whimsically inserted by a man on the internet that went on to become canon in my head for the past 6 years or so. But whatever happened with chapter 911, look, it's only the second biggest 9/11 conspiracy in the world, so I can let it go. But in conclusion, this title tells us nothing at all, except that Elbaph has officially begun. Because if Wano is satisfied being called a basic adventure, then Elbaph, look, it could last anywhere from 1 to 4 years. At this stage, it's still pretty impossible to predict. But I guess the bigger thing is that we have confirmation that we are, in fact, actually on the Elbaph, and the crew got here whilst heavily intoxicated. There's a fun idea that they all got so drunk and hallucinating that they let Zoro navigate the Thousand Sunny and somehow ended up in the exact right spot. And from there, they stole some clothes and decided to have an RPG adventure in the Lego castle. And okay, let's talk some more about Lego. With the previous chapter, I genuinely thought that we were onto some pretty good ideas, which was that Nami was either in a giant Lego castle owned by giant children, or that the whole thing was a hallucination. And as it turns out, neither of those things were true, and we are currently in an entire Lego village. I do think that this is quite charming because all of the plant life are Lego as well, which really pops out in stark contrast to the very real Yggdrasil tree in the background, which we'll talk about in a bit. I just didn't expect to go full Lego. No one goes full Lego. No matter how much Denmark begs us to do it, we don't. And I have a hard time believing that the Lego aesthetic is just how the giants on this particular section of Elbaph prefer to build their dwellings, because in our other glimpses of Elbaph, we've seen very traditional wood and stone structures. So look, if I had to guess, and to be clear, I don't have to do this, but I will. But my guess is that the Lego would be the result of a devil fruit ability, a paramecia that can generate Lego or transform stuff into Lego, something along those lines. Because usually when we encounter these whimsical island features, there tends to be a more sinister fruit, some explanation behind them. And my first thought was obviously all of the toys on Dressrosa. In the first few chapters of that arc, they were absolutely delightful before we learned that these were actual people and animals transformed against their will and subject to eternal slavery. And I'd say the same thing for Whole Cake Island as well. We got to the Empire of Totterland and it was a magical Disneyland of funsome living objects that, as it turns out, were created by siphoning off parts of people's souls to bring them to life. so I'm very wary of this Lego as a result. Although the Lego is far from the only bizarre thing that's happening in this chapter, and also it may not necessarily be sinister. If we're going with the idea of Loki as a traditional Loki trickster, then this could be him playing an epic prank on this area and turning their whole village into Lego for a bit of a lull. And because Loki is the Prince of Elbaph, everyone just has to put up with his crap. The ability itself could be something similar to Jola's art Devil Fruit, where she can turn anyone and anything into whatever she perceives to be art. Her vision tends to be more skewed towards modern art, but it could actually be quite versatile. But in this case, it would allow the user to transform anyone or anything into whatever their childlike desires dictate. But the other huge thing that we've already briefly touched on is that we finally got confirmation that the tree on Elbaph is actually named Yggdrasil, which seems fairly obvious, and a lot of people are gonna go, yeah man, on the internet, I already knew that in the comments, but you didn't. It was likely, but never guaranteed, because Oda does weird things like put cats in crowns and make them transform into lions. However, the tree itself does seem fairly regular, deceptively regular. At first glance, it definitely doesn't look like it houses 9 realms, or any realms for that matter. I don't see a single realm on that tree. And it has been a very popular idea to suggest that the Elbaph castle was on the tippy top of Yggdrasil, and that may still be the case, but this tree, it definitely looks a lot more normal than I anticipated at this stage. But really, the highlight of this chapter for me, it is quite simple because it is new Straw Hat outfit day. Starting with Luffy, I think he looks perfect. This is almost exactly how I imagined his Elbaph outfit, right down to the horns and the axe. He's so perfect that there's surprisingly little to say about him. Dude's just having the time of his life, dressed like the Viking that we all predicted he would. But then we move on to the absolute treat that is Usopp. More so than any other character, Oda seems to feel that he has an extreme degree of creative license with Usopp, and I love what he's done here. Because if I'm not mistaken, this design is inspired by Asterisk and Obelix, more specifically Obelix with the big old stripy pants. And I love any time that Usopp is given a beard. It reminds me of the big bushy Film Z beard. And you know what? Usopp actually had 2 beards in Film Z. The other was the creepy disguise as Robin's exotic dance manager. But this is what I mean. Usopp, he is such a good character actor. And I'm looking forward to seeing him really develop his Elbaph persona in this costume. However, I think my personal favorite of the Elbaph outfit so far is definitely Sanji, because it is just so sleek. And he looks a lot less like a Viking and more like a knight, which is an aesthetic that fits him perfectly, with all of his emphasis on the chivalries and everything. I also think that this could be a reference to Sanji's prototype character Romeo, who was a protagonist in one of Eiichiro Oda's many failed one-shots called The Great Swordsman, which was the birth of the Zoro-Sanji rivalry, just with Ryuma and Romeo. Sanji's outfit also gives me a very Guts Berserk vibe, which is I think because of the cloak draped on his chest, and also the sword on his back, which, you know, that is actually encroaching dangerously on Zoro territory. I'd be surprised if Zoro has said nothing about that. Although right now I'm imagining that Sanji's sword is actually being used more like a colossal kitchen knife, something to effectively cook all of the giant creatures and other ingredients that they've been encountering so far. And just on that, it would seem as if the monster trio have already cooked and eaten a potential Elbaph deity. And you know, it's a good thing that Luffy resembles another one of their deities, or we may have had some problems here. I may still have problems. Problems are going to happen regardless. With all of that said, the outfit I'm definitely feeling least at the moment is Zoro's. I'm very conflicted with the whole goggles and the shoulder pads. It's definitely not the best he's ever looked in my opinion. The goggles in particular, they're an interesting touch. They look a lot like skiing goggles. And Oda does seem to enjoy that clash of modern and old aesthetics, because it reminds me of a classic drawing he did of Luffy dressed in Viking gear with goggles, which I do think is fun. I tend to enjoy when Oda jams 2 aesthetic ideas into one, like on Egghead Island, where some of the crew were given fun future outfits and the others were given relaxing Hawaiian shirts to wear. It was a really cool blend of stuff. To be fair though, I've used the word goggles a lot, but I think what Zoro is actually wearing is a mask. Like he's taken that traditional Viking helmet, then removed the helmet part and just retaining the facial aspect, but look, I don't know, it doesn't really work for me. At the moment, I think Zoro looks like he's going to a Persona audition to become one of the Phantom Thieves. But the main reason why I'm not a huge fan is because I feel like I've seen this outfit before. Zoro's Elbaph outfit reminds me a lot of his Beast Pirates garb during the initial sequence of the raid on Onigashima, with the shoulder pads in particular being extraordinarily similar. And you know, I've seen a lot of people making the comparison between Zoro and Diaz Drake during the Wano arc, but my first non-Zoro comparison went to a very different place. I looked at his outfit and the first thing that came to my mind was Mouse Man, because he also has the shoulder pad goggle combination going on. And doesn't he look simply marvelous? That's the style that Zoro saw and went, mate, I'm gonna get me some mouse. But to be fair, I have a similar criticism about Nami as well. We saw part of Nami's outfit in the last chapter, and we got our first full view here. And I have to say that like Luffy, this is more or less exactly what I expected. Nami outfits tend to be fairly simple to predict because Oda has a policy of using as little fabric as possible on her, so there's only so many options. And just a quick tangent, I gave one of my channel artists the task of predicting the Elbaph outfits for the Straw Hats, and he came up with this Nami, which I love. I'm a big fan of the fur draped from the head and the very fluffy boots. However, I do vividly recall saying to him that I bet Nami's outfit would be showing at least 50% more skin, because I know Eiichiro Oda, not personally, but I've read enough fictional pirate stories enough times now to have a realistic view of his aesthetic tendencies. But it's also one of the more disappointing outfits so far. Just like Zoro, I feel like we've already seen this on Nami, because it really reminds me of Nami's Beast Pirate outfit as well. And I'm really hoping that this arc lasts long enough to get a change of wardrobe for both her and Zoro. But also, I'm very well aware that this impression will likely change once the official colors of the outfits are released. Once that happens, they'll probably look a bit more distinct in my brain. But right now, I'm just kind of there about those two, but very positive about everyone else. I was also very positive about Nami's involvement in this chapter. I really enjoyed the beginning, and I like the decision to use Nami as our perspective. One of the difficulties that Eiichiro Oda has with late stage One Piece is to make locations actually feel dangerous. Because we're at a point where Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji each have bounties worth over 1 billion berries. And there's really only a handful of characters left in One Piece who can realistically give them a tough time. They're not gonna be bothered by a cat in a crown, as demonstrated, because as soon as they show up, any sense of danger and tension instantly evaporates. So that's why Oda chose Nami, because even though she's extremely capable, Nami is still a very vulnerable character. And she's one of the only Straw Hats that we can use to feel this sense of adventurous danger. And she's then joined by Usopp, an equally as vulnerable character, and the two of them make a fantastic team for exploring new scary locations. It's actually interesting just how little Oda has used both of them for this purpose in the past. The best example I can think of would be Thriller Bark, where Nami, Usopp, and Chopper were the advance party, and it was fantastic because they were all terrified out of their minds by the zombies, whereas every other crew member when they got to the island were very casual. Seeing Thriller Bark through the eyes of Nami, Usopp, and Chopper was the only way to experience its full potential as a location. Because as soon as you let Luffy loose, the island loses that horror atmosphere. And it's the same thing here for Elbaph. But as alluded to before, there's more weird stuff going on here than just Lego, because we do also have the cat that can transform into a lion and then back into a cat, which usually I would attribute to being devil fruit related. Animals who have eaten devil fruits have become very common in One Piece, and this in particular makes me think of Onimaru on Wano, who had a mythical Zoan fruit, but it could also be a creature under the influence of a greater, much more trixier power, the same sort of power that's creating all of the Lego. But at this moment, it's almost impossible to predict what's happening, why it's happening, where it's happening, and why where it's happening is Lego. And all of this shows one of the greatest strengths of Oda, because even after 27 years of writing the story, he can still start a new arc and make One Piece feel like a brand new world. So I could not be more thrilled to finally be on this legendary island. And if you've got any predictions for just what the crap is going on here, then feel free to leave them in the comments below. This is not Monkey D. Luffy. That's the current working idea. Because there's a lot of really suspicious stuff going on in this chapter. So much more than I noticed the first time I read it. Stuff that just does not happen in One Piece. And it all begins with the following comment. Fun fact, the Monster Trio's combo attack is a reference to the attack they used on a sand lizard in Alabasta. That is 100% correct. It's so correct that you could practically accuse Oda of plagiarizing himself. The art is of course identical, and I love this callback because this is the moment where Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji got labeled as the Monster Trio by fans, likely because of a mistranslation in the very early scans of One Piece that existed before the official release got to this point, as it comes from Nami's dialogue afterwards where she says, "Against those three at once, that monster never had a chance." And to this very day, that's why Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji are known as the Monster Trio. But also, that's not the only similarity between these two chapters. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji fought the Sand Lizard in chapter 162, which, as I mentioned in the last video, was the kickoff for Alabasta being titled Adventure in the Kingdom of Sand. And it also just so happened to feature a plot point of Luffy hallucinating after eating a crazy cactus. Now, we don't know for sure what's going on with any hallucinations just yet, but there's a lot of similarities happening here, especially because Oda purposely chose the Alabasta crew minus Chopper to use as well. And look, to be completely open and honest here, I feel like I'm being tricked. Not necessarily that the crew are being tricked, but that Oda is doing all of this to trick the reader somehow. So let me explain more about my paranoia. This chapter contains something that I almost never see in One Piece, which are blatant errors. Things do go wrong in One Piece from time to time. A very famous example is when a chapter was published where Zoro had Luffy's chest scar. And there's a whole section of these errors on the One Piece wiki. But the page, mate, it is unbelievably short because these errors almost never happen. But in this chapter, the first error is that Luffy's weapon changes between panels. When he's sitting on top of the defeated kitty cat, he very clearly has a sword on his back. However, when we see his full body shot, that sword has now become an axe. And I'm also pretty sure that there was a dialogue error. Against the cat, Luffy uses gear 4th, but it's not gear 4th. It's very clearly just gear 3rd. And it's not a mistranslation either. The Japanese text says gear 4th. The official translation will probably clear up whether this is intentional or not, because they have the time delay advantage of fixing stuff like this. And sure, I could see this being a simple mistake. After gear 5th, we haven't really needed to use gear 4th. And whether it was Oda or one of the typesetters, look, these mistakes can happen. The numbers are usually right next to each other. But that is the second error in a single chapter. They're not huge mistakes, but this is unusually sloppy work for One Piece. And it's starting to make me wonder if I'm hallucinating, because I'm both seeing and hearing things that are not true. Hence why I feel like there is a chance that Oda is doing this on purpose to trick the audience and to see if they pick up on these little clues. Because another question I have after reading this chapter is, where is Luffy's straw hat? It doesn't look like he's pulling a chopper and wearing a helmet over the hat. And initially I thought, no problem, he's probably just wearing it on his back as he often does. But in the shot of him attacking the lion, we see Luffy's back and there is no hat to be found. And not only that, but there is no axe or sword to be found. There is no weapon on his back at all, which is another art error. With the straw hat, Luffy could easily be keeping it elsewhere. But it's odd to see him without the straw hat visibly on his person. And it's a culmination of these little things adding up that make me feel that something isn't quite right here. There's too many little questions, and I wonder if what we're seeing is still Nami hallucinating, or even everyone hallucinating together, having a shared delusion. Perhaps even including the giants that we saw in the village. Because I know that Elbaph, it was meant to be a wild world to step into, but these people are living in a proper surreal fantasy Legoland. So how about this? All of this is Loki's doing, and one of the straw hats is not who they seem. It could be Loki impersonating them and having fun, and given that all of these errors so far revolve around Luffy, the art inconsistencies, the incorrectly stated attack name, and potentially the missing straw hat, with all of that in mind, perhaps the man we're seeing right now isn't even our captain. In this chapter, we don't even see Luffy's eyes. They're either closed or obscured by the helmet. So look, I'm not confident enough to call the emergency meeting just yet, but I think that we should keep a much closer eye than usual on the next few chapters, because I am starting to feel like something is trying to trick me, and I don't like it. Maybe the answer could be something along the lines of Loki having the fable fruit, and his powers are capable of bringing old stories and concepts to life and even inserting himself into them. Charlotte Mondor had a similar power with the book fruit, where he could trap people within stories. And also, I'm kind of stuck on the tree. The Yggdrasil, it just looks so small and so thin. And every time we've ever caught a glimpse of this tree, it's been so colossal that no frame in media history has been wide enough to capture its full girth. So maybe we are in a story of Elbaph from the past, which is why the tree we're seeing is smaller, but also another thing. And I actually think this is more likely, but one of the classical depictions of Yggdrasil does show a massive tree holding up an entire civilization, with its thinnest toppest point almost looking like a completely separate tree. So maybe in our absinthe-induced stupor, we haven't just already made it to Elbaph, but we have ascended to the top of Yggdrasil. And what we're seeing right now is the very peak of that tree, a different realm to the lower one. And the other half of the Straw Hat's going to explore that lower part, which we're more familiar with. There's so many questions, and every time I reread this chapter, I only have more questions, which is wild because on paper, not a lot happens in this chapter. My review is mostly focused on outfits. But if you look at the actual drawings and the words on said paper, there's a pretty ridiculous amount happening here, whether it's intentional or not. And another thing that could indicate that we're quite high right now, and in more ways than one, is the frequency in which we're hearing about gods. In this chapter, we hear both about the ear god and the sun god. That second one sounds a bit familiar. But to the best of my admittedly low quantity of knowledge, Asgard is the highest point of Yggdrasil and home of all of the gods and such, with the mortal beings living on a lower plane. So this ear god could be one of these residents who was recently eaten, and I can just imagine the political problems this is going to cause on Elbaph. Any moment now, Loki's going to make an unhinged speech claiming they're eating the gods, they're eating the cats. But obviously we can't ignore that someone in Elbaph is using the sun god title. And in Norse mythology, I believe the sun god's name is Sol. well. But I'm very keen to meet whoever this is because I have to imagine that they're dressed like Nika, because Dory and Brocky instantly recognize Gearfifth Luffy as looking very similar to one of their deities. And before we move on, just another thing. I've seen a lot of people pointing out that Sanji is using Ifrit Jump whilst Luffy and Zoro are being a bit more basic, and they're using it as Sanji slander to say that he has to go all out just to reach the base of Luffy and Zoro. I don't know why we're like this as a fan base, but if you've had this thought, what you need to do, right, you need to get off Twitter or Reddit, and then we go outside, and remember that Nami was in danger, meaning that Sanji isn't messing around here. Luffy and Zoro are confident in what they need to use to bring down a lion, but Sanji is very no-nonsense when it comes to women. He's even dressed like a knight in shining armor. If a woman is in trouble, there is no room for error, and that's why Sanji will go straight for the overkill. Did anyone else notice that the giant bees were roughly the same size in the panel with the locals and the panel with Nami? I don't think we are in a village with giants, or at least not giants. If they're not giants, what would you even call them? Smallants? Humans, really. But this is another odd thing, and I think that no matter what, Elbaph, it's going to be a very aesthetically trippy arc, because Oda, he's already quite loose when it comes to consistent sizing, and combining that with the idea of being on a giant island results in panels like this, where the bees do look kind of the same size compared to the giants as they did in the panel with Nami. My initial answer to this is perspective. In the panel with the giants, the bees are way in the foreground, whereas the giants, they're way further into the background, thus making the giants look smaller. But then again, the giants, they also make a big deal out of these bees. But if they were actual bee size to them, then you wouldn't really notice, right? I feel like if a bee fell from the sky in front of me, I don't think I'd even register it. And I should also say the Big Stein Castle has not earned its name. It looks far less than big, because the whole thing seems to be proportioned to humans. There's no way that giants are fitting inside of this thing. They can barely get that cat in there. So I think this could be Oda screwing with us on purpose, setting up for a joke that the Big Stein Castle is actually the smallest building in the village. But the giants also mentioned the ear god and just how enormous it is, which makes it sound like the ear god is even bigger than the giants. So it's really difficult to get a proper sense of scale right now, which I suspect is a combination of trippy perspective and Oda deliberately messing with us. As I keep saying, something weird is happening here. None of what we're seeing is natural, and the answers will come eventually, maybe. You did not think of Mouse Man when you saw Zoro this chapter. Who thinks of Mouse Man in general? How dare you accuse me of not thinking about Mouse Man? If I wasn't thinking about him, then how did my brain message my body to write his name in the review? Everyone thinks about Mouse Man. This is a you problem. The monster trio deserve to be on the thumbnail together. We got a combo attack like this 600 chapters before. Why leave my man Sanji out? So a couple of reasons. One is that art costs money, meaning that more art costs more money. The second is that my artist was actually drawing this the day before a wedding where she was the maid of honor, so we didn't really have a lot of time. I honestly feel lucky I got a thumbnail a little. And thirdly, Sanji is in the thumbnail. If you look very closely, I gave Zoro Sanji's outfit because I really didn't like the look of Zoro's all that much. So I stole Sanji's clothing and put it to good use. I'm calling it now. The reason there's a bunch of girls disappearing in Wano is due to Momonosuke building a harem. I mean, that would be the absolutely Kozuki Oden move. And someone replied to this comment saying, Momonosuke is 8 years old. This joke is deeply weird. And I just want to say that this isn't necessarily a joke, because what happened with Momonosuke's father is infinitely weirder. When we were hearing about Oden's history, Oda stated that he started roaming the red light district and frequenting the quote pleasure halls when he was 6 years old. And then of course it was at the age of 15 that he built his harem, which led to a full-scale conflict known as the Harem Revolt and involved a lot of upset husbands. So I agree, it is weird, but it's canonically weird. And we should also point out that it's not just women being kidnapped, we're also missing Minatomo. So if this is happening, then it's a harem of very diverse tastes. Oda's keeping the best outfits for last with Brook, Frankie, and Robin. Mate, he always does. Brook and Frankie in particular always look amazing, because Oda has full permission to do something weird for the sake of weird with a cyborg and a skeleton. We better see Frankie interact with the Lego building in some way. This powerful technology could be the next big breakthrough for the Straw Hats. Alright, so here's my thinking. That exact sentence, minus all the Lego, is exactly what we were saying about Frankie on Egghead Island. The idea is that he was going to come away from this island with a powersome new technology to incorporate into himself, into Frankie's Shogun, the Thousand Sunny, maybe even all three. And then what happened was not that, which is why the Lego actually kind of makes a stupid amount of sense. If Frankie did come away with something, it wouldn't be the straightforward thing because this is One Piece. Why adopt the 500 plus year into the future super tech when there's Lego lying around on the floor? It's the more fun solution, and Oda will always take the path that is the most fun. Please bring back Bingo for Elbaph. We've already got one. Elbaph is currently part of our 2024 Bing card, which were predictions I took from all of you at the beginning of the year. And here's where we currently stand. We've gotten 6 correct and are currently threatening a Bing. However, it's reliant on Vivi rejoining the crew, which I'm not so sure about at this stage. Don't think we have time. And we're probably locked out of a couple of other options as well this late into the year, and more importantly, this early into a brand new arc. So I don't see Shanks versus Blackbeard happening, for example, and Kizaru's redemption opportunity, that's probably long gone. And as for Dragon doing something, well, that was always a long shot, but there is still plenty of potential stuff to tick off as we dive into Elbaph. Do you think we will have new bounties? Yes and no. Usually new bounties happen at the end of arcs or in the in-between sections of arcs. And after the Egghead incident, I definitely think that the Straw Hats have earned a bounty increase. I just don't know how you get away with keeping Luffy at 3 billion after that, as well as the rest of the crew, because they've now caused one of the single worst incidents in world government history. But my thinking is that we might skip those bounties for now, because we're heading to an isolated island. And maybe once we get off Elbaph, we'll learn what Egghead did to the value of the crew, which I think would hit a bit harder because it's been 2 years, but Luffy's 3 billion berry bounty still seems way too recent for me. And say we're on Elbaph for another 2 years, and that'll make it 4 years between new bounties, and it'll just smack that little bit more good. That's, sometimes I'm not good with words. And also, that could potentially be Luffy's final bounty increase going into Laugh Tale and such. And it also gives those around him more time to build up their notoriety if needed. Luffy currently has the lowest bounty of the modern 4 emperors, and I think that Oda would prefer it to stay that way in order to keep Luffy in that underdog position. And at this stage, for a bounty increase to actually mean anything, we're looking at big numbers. There's not a lot of places to go from 3 billion, and I reckon that we would be looking at crashing that 5 billion mark and really encroaching on the numbers of Roger and Whitebeard. But also, Luffy can't just leave everyone else in the dust. This time on Elbaph, this gap with us from the world, could give Blackbeard some more time to build himself up. Buggy and Crossguild can still climb higher with their opposing bounty system, and maybe even Shanks. This is looking way too far ahead right now, but we could leave Elbaph, get a new set of bounties, and discover that, say, Blackbeard is now the highest valued emperor for some incredibly shocking incident that took place while we were playing with Lego. The other interesting thing to figure out will be whether or not Elbaph adopts an act system like Wano, but also like Egghead Island. Egghead wasn't broken into literal acts like Wano, but there was a very distinct Act 1 and Act 2, which were Day 1 and Day 2 with that overnight time skip in between, whilst we spent time elsewhere in the world with the Garps and the Sabos and the Shankses. So I guess there is also a possibility that Oda incorporates the rest of the world into the Elbaph arc, because even outside of that time skip, Egghead was a very global affair. I'm not too sure about that though. Something like that worked really well for Egghead Island because it was a Nexus arc that was building up to one big global communication, so it made a lot of sense to keep the rest of the world involved at every step. But Elbaph, well, I guess it's too early to judge, but I would assume it's more like Wano, an isolated island with its own thing going on, and constantly cutting back to the outside world might ultimately harm that idea. So for the foreseeable future, I think that we should be looking exclusively at Elbaph. However, Eiichiro Oda, mate, you are more than free to surprise me with whatever the crap you want to do anywhere else as well. This Elbaph is not what it seems. This sun god is no warrior of liberation, and this mirror is not a good idea to put in the women's quarters Sanji. And then Gear 5th casually strolls its way into this chapter. And did you catch what happened with it? Because I didn't. I completely missed it the first time. And we'll get into that, but first, I really liked the opening of this chapter because the crew were acting exactly like the fans did at the end of the last chapter. They're so confused about their current situation that they're offering their own theories. My favorite is that Nami suggests that they were all gigantified, which, actually not an outrageous idea, considering she's now seen Luffy become a giant twice on Wano and on Egghead Island, so there are powers out there that can feasibly result in gigantification. However, thanks to Sanji, we've now confirmed that Robin is nowhere in the immediate vicinity. In the last video, I was making a big deal about Chopper using his nose to potentially find everyone, and as it turns out, Sanji's nose is much more better, at least for women, which is a legitimately useful utility in the Pervert's toolkit, like how Sanji was able to use his woman radar to find and protect Bonnie on Egghead Island. I think Oda's realizing that it's very difficult to chide Sanji for his ways when they have very beneficial side effects. But this is what I would describe as an unusually creepy chapter of the One Piece, because this series, it goes dark at times, but it doesn't generally bridge into this sort of territory. The whole idea of this model world is, it's quite sinister, because if I'm understanding this correctly, and I may not be, everything on Elbaph right now, if we're even on Elbaph right now, is unreliable chaos. But if I am understanding understanding the situation, then what we have is at least one giant who has been capturing humans to put in his diorama society and may very well have been doing this for generations. The people we're seeing in this world could have been born in the model. Remember that the lifespans of giants are somewhere between 300 to 400 years. So this could be quite a long-running experiment where we've seen multiple generations of people, and it creeps me the crap out. Another morbid thought I had is that Sanji essentially cooked and ate some giant's pet rabbit, because that was clearly no ear god, but well. And something I also wonder is if these humans believe they're giants. Like, do they believe that they were born on Elbaph and that they're really big people? It's all very ethically questionable, to say the least. Very Truman Show with Lego. And you've got to wonder what all these other humans, I guess they are gonna do after learning that their entire existence is a lie. Although I think there could be quite the brilliant reason why Eiichiro Oda has elected to begin this arc in such a weird way. And I'm wondering if the model world might be a manageable way of introducing us to Elbaph without instantly being overwhelmed by its scale. As if what we're seeing right now is the experience of Elbaph that a giant would receive, and then when we do get into the actual island, we're going to see all of the same architecture, just one, obviously not made of Lego, and two, unfathomably bigger. It's like looking at a map of a country. It boils this massive entity down to a much more manageable mental image. And the idea reminds me a lot of Tiny Huge Island in Super Mario 64, which was a level where you could visit a miniature version of it or a gigantic version of it. And right now we could be in the miniature Elbaph. Our sun god must have taken inspiration from something to build this model society, and it would be really cool if we eventually visited the landmarks like Big Stein's castle, but this time everything was to giant scale. But look, non-consensual human experiments aside, this arc so far, really fun. This chapter was especially enjoyable because it gave us a lot of those classic Straw Hat crew interactions. We have Sanji getting annoyed at Zoro for enabling Luffy. We have Nami knowing exactly what Luffy's reaction to the warning would be. We also have Nami extorting Chopper, and Sanji being a pervert wanting to install some of the glass in the women's quarters of the Sunny. All the stuff that we don't have time for once the story of an arc really kicks into gear and Oda begins focusing more on lore drops and large-scale plot points that need to be dealt with immediately as chaos rapidly builds and spirals out of control into a grand explosive ending. This is not that. This is the comparatively calm breathing time that we get once every few years. And it really makes me want a One Piece spin-off focused on the mundane in-between moments of the Straw Hat crew. Like what happens on the Thousand Sunny during the travel time between islands. Because these interactions are, or at least they were, the lifeblood of One Piece. Seeing the chemistry of our crew and getting back to Luffy's core mission, which is to just have a fun adventure. So I'm very grateful that we're getting as much of that as possible in these chapters. Although my favorite Straw Hat interaction in this chapter was definitely the one between Luffy and Usopp, where Luffy says, "Bruh, you should have been able to defeat the big cat. Remember, Usopp, this is post-time skip. We can do that sort of thing now." Which at first glance is a fun joke at Usopp's expense as always, but it actually highlights something much deeper, which is the faith that Luffy has in Usopp. At this stage, Luffy probably understands Usopp's true abilities better than Usopp himself does, because Luffy doesn't have that layer of fear clouding his assessment. I don't think I have anyone who believes in me as much as Luffy believes in Usopp. In fact, I doubt many of you do, because Luffy's belief borders on zealotry. He has equal faith in each and every crew member. He's not the One Piece fanbase. He doesn't see Usopp as below Zoro, Sanji, and the rest. Luffy knows what Usopp is capable of, and in this case, he's just a little surprised that he didn't see it in action. So this could be wishful thinking, but this could be the start of Usopp's own personal arc, because we're here now. We are on Elbaph, maybe. Again, still not confirmed at this stage, but we're starting to reach a point of now or never for Usopp. Rather unfortunately, he's very much the first in line to make his dream of becoming a brave warrior of the sea a reality. And we're now in a story arc based on the giants who have inspired him to come as far as he has. And I do think that he's going to need to prove himself on this island in some way or another, because when you've got the captain going, "Mate, you got to start packing up these cats," then you're gonna feel the pressure to pack some cats. But while we wait for Usopp to summon his courage, let's talk about our imposter sun god. The first thing to say is that he or she, actually no, that's the first thing to say. I think that this sun god might be a she, because when we see maybe her walking down the hallway, there's a close-up of the sun god wearing high heels, which Oda does traditionally reserve for women unless you are Dellinger or Doflamingo. And if that that's the case, it makes this situation fairly immediately less scary to me. Because when it comes to introducing women as antagonists in an arc early on, Oda has a very standard formula, which is the femme fatale that transforms into an ally, like Viola on Dressrosa, Pudding on Whole Cake Island, Hiyori on Wano, Stussy on Egghead, etc. Beautiful women don't often stay enemies for long, and in fact they usually turn out to be the victims that we go on to help. So I can definitely see the Sun God removing that horrid deer mask to reveal a drop-dead gorgeous giant woman, and that would be the classic Oda subversion, sort of like what he did with Yamato, setting up this lurking, fearsome, potentially antagonistic presence just to subvert it with beauty. And it feels like what we're waiting for is for this to be a moment of big misunderstanding. We've set up this terrifying and kind of sickening scenario, and then it could all turn out to be something much more innocent that the Straw Hat stumbled into and ruined after getting smashed on Absinthe. However, I don't know if this is just Oda messing with perspective and scale for the sake of fun art, but the Sun God looks massive even for a giant. Like, this giant makes giants look not giant. Most Elbaph giants we've met are somewhere between 17 to 22 meters tall, so they make humans look small, but nowhere near as small as the Sun God is currently making the crew look. In fact, right now the Sun God seems more similar to the height of Oz, who is just under 70 meters tall. And so there's some very cool potential that what we're actually seeing here is another ancient giant, or a descendant of an ancient giant. And instead of ending up in the friendly part of Warland, we've gotten so drunk that we've stumbled into this very antagonistic territory of the ancient giants. I definitely hold off on that though, because it could just be Oda messing with scale. It's usually not a good idea to judge the size of anything from just a few panels, which is going to be a very consistent issue throughout the entire arc as we make our way through the very trippy giant society. Although, to Oda's credit, he has been remarkably consistent with scale so far. Like in the last chapter, when the bees looked a similar size to Nami compared to the people that we thought were giants. Turns out they looked similar because those people, not giants. Makes sense. And a lot of you thought that I was absolutely crazy for bringing up the bees, but as it turns out, you're only half right. Because I did, admittedly, say a lot of crazy things about chapter 1127, but it's one of those situations where we were right to be paranoid, but wrong in what exactly to be paranoid about. It's like when you believe so deeply in a conspiracy theory that turns out to be false, but only because there was an even crazier conspiracy theory happening in its place. Having brought that up though, I do think there's a discussion to be had about all of the errors in the last chapter, because it is looking like they were just production issues, and that's very unfortunate because it means that the last chapter was just plain sloppy, and there's not a huge amount of good excuses as to why. Like I said, as we painstakingly pointed them all out, there was an error on almost every single page. And there's still inconsistencies in this chapter as a result. For example, Nami now has her sword back after it mysteriously vanished halfway through the last chapter. So this is one of those situations where I'm really looking forward to the volume release, which is something that I almost never say, but it's because the volume versions are considered to be the final versions of these chapters. What we see every week in Weekly Shonen Jump is a glorified draft, because these chapters then get taken and polished further to be published in the volumes, which is also where they fix up any errors that have slipped bi-weekly. A great example of this is the notorious statement by Jinbei that Katakuri's devil fruit was a Logia during Whole Cake Island. This was published in Weekly Shonen Jump as a Logia, but in the volume release, the dialogue was changed to special paramecia. And it's the core reason why, to this very day, people still believe that Katakuri was a Logia user, because in defense of those people, that's what it said in the manga at one point. Here's the thing though, weird things are still happening here. Human stuck in a model Elbaph doesn't explain everything. And what it especially does not explain is the shape-shifting cat that can transform into a lion. So there are still some odd things happening here that are gonna need some explaining. But going back to the Sun God briefly, the use of the deer skull is quite a striking element. Not just because it's all creepy and such, but because it immediately brought my mind to the Holy Knights. Specifically that member wearing a very similar skull who we met behind a very young Figurland Garling in Kuma's part of the God Valley flashback. I do think it would be pretty meh to try and draw a connection between those two because of that alone, but I do find it curious that Oda would use such a strong design choice for two characters in such quick succession. You don't just give people stag skulls as a common piece of headwear, and so I'm really looking forward to learning more about this Sun God, if that is indeed your real name, as well as that one Holy Knight who doesn't even have a name, provided he even survived the God Valley incident. And that brings us to Gear 5th. Something very, very special happened with Gear 5th in this chapter. And I really enjoyed Luffy's use of Gear 5th because it might seem like overkill for everyone who becomes overly concerned with all of the powering and the scaling. I've seen a few comments confused as to why Luffy's using his ultimate form against what is probably a very basic Elbaph snake, but he's using it because it's thematic. During this chapter, Luffy and the crew realize that they were trapped in someone else's fabricated world, and any sense of feeling trapped is unacceptable to the warrior of liberation. So this is Luffy's way of taking that freedom back, asserting that no one controls his freedom but him. And there's also that very curious thing that you may or may not have noticed, but Luffy's clothing doesn't change when he enters Gear 5th. This is extremely noteworthy because on Egghead Island, when Luffy activated this form, Oda abandoned the Egghead outfit entirely. Luffy just switched to his more basic Gear 5th attire. Whereas now on what is maybe Elbaph, or at least a model of Elbaph, Luffy seems to have embraced his Viking attire, and it does change, it changes color, but Luffy elects to keep the outfit on. He seems to feel free in his Viking garb in a way that he didn't in the future outfit of Egghead. I'm really glad he's keeping it though, because Gear 5th is one of those ideas that can risk getting stale if you don't keep introducing new elements to it, and now I'm really excited for every new outfit change because it presents the possibility of a brand new looking Gear 5th form, with my favorite aspect of this one being that Luffy's Viking helmet disappeared and he's using his hair to make the horns instead. I didn't even notice that at first, it took my artist to point that out. Although the other thing about this is the actual sun god, not the giant in this chapter, the proper one that the giants of Elbaph worship. My guess would be that the actual sun god wore something very similar to how Luffy is dressed right now. Given that he was a deity of Elbaph, being garbed in Elbaphian wear makes sense. So I'm expecting a giant to see Luffy using Gear 5th at some point and be blown away that Luffy looks almost exactly the same as some sort of ancient sun god statue or painting or other depiction. And if I was the fake sun god, the skull sun god in this situation, I would be overjoyed because I would have stumbled upon a super rare model to use in whatever's going on here, maybe some sort of Elbaph warhammer. I mean, the room outside the box did look disturbingly like a hobby den. And in the end, I can't fault Luffy's logic of running all the way to the other side to hopefully find another mirror to break, and who knows what we'll find beyond that. Perhaps this is all some elaborate exhibit in a giant museum, and what we found in this chapter was the maintenance room behind it. I don't know, almost literally anything is possible, and you let me know what you think in the comments below. Gear 5th embracing the costume/clothing of the area is perfect for the Nika legend. As every place has their own interpretation of the god of liberation, it makes him more relatable to every species. I think that this is a perfect way to put it, because there is this question of how so many unrelated cultures each have a belief in the sun god. But if the original Nika was someone like Luffy visiting all of these cultures and incorporating their traditional clothing into the freedom fit, then it makes a lot of sense. So far, a sun god has been flagged in the cultures of giants, buccaneers, and Shandians, and I can see Nika meeting the sky people, and like Luffy now taking on the Viking horns, Nika grows a pair of wings for a nice thematic adventure. There's no sun god in Fishman culture, and I suspect that's because Joy Boy failed. If he'd succeeded, then he would have become that sun god legend for them, but he didn't, and so they have no one to worship except for the idea of the sun itself. And something I didn't think about in the last video is that Luffy here, he looks less like a giant and more like an Oni. In fact, his Gear 5th form at the moment looks pretty strikingly like Kaido with the horns and the cloak, and it makes me want to see a situation where Luffy deliberately mimics his opponent's outfits in Gear 5th, because that's just the kind of thing that Luffy does. If he sees something that looks cool, he tries it out, like how he stole Wapol's eating technique and used it on Crocodile. I wonder if they call him the sun god because he turns on and off the lamp to their terrarium. That would be amazing. If the sun god doesn't even call themselves the sun god, this is all just Lego world canon that the citizens have conjured because of a flip on and off every day. It's very Eiichiro Oda's sense of humor. However, there is some pretty blatant sun symbology happening here, with the sun being depicted on both the shield and the staff. And not only that, but this is a very familiar sun. The sun on the shield looks like it has 8 points, which is a very consistent number. That's the number of dots that the sun symbol had in Kuma's church, and also the number of flames around the sun on the alabaster flag. So we're continuing this idea that each culture has their own depiction of the same sun god, and so they also have their own variants of that same sun symbol. All different, but remarkably consistent. Someone in the comments also pointed out to me that it's not just the staggering size of the sun god giant that we should be blown away by, but also the fact that a skull is being worn as a helmet, implying the existence of unbelievably large deer as well. So what we're doing at the moment, we're starting at a more house pet sort of level, but more so than most arcs, I am really looking forward to exploring the fauna of Elbaph, because even the most mundane creatures are going to be massive and amazing, although that may not necessarily be true. Because in Big Mom's flashback, I do remember that she accidentally killed a bear on Elbaph, and the bear itself itself was quite normal sized, so who knows exactly how the wildlife of Elbaph function at the moment. Feels like they stumbled into some giant's D&D game. Chapter of the title was RPG. Maybe all the people in there are playing their characters. I do quite like that idea. That would definitely save this whole situation from being one of the most creepy and horrific things to have ever happened in One Piece. If all the humans in Legoland were well aware of their situation and they were functioning as glorified NPCs to guide the Straw Hats through a pre-written campaign with the Sun God acting as the DM. The only thing I'm not so sure about are the two dudes speaking amongst themselves, the guys that saw all the bees fall from the sky. Even though the Straw Hats weren't around, they were still in character, which, man, is solid commitment if they are actors. But it feels like everyone in this world believes that it's real. And the same sort of thing goes for the cat, running away terrified of the Sun God. If this was in fact an act, then it probably wouldn't be fleeing for its life. However, something that does support the game idea is that Nami found a map, and this is a bit odd because it came completely out of nowhere. They're all just riding this cat, and Nami says, "Anyway, guys, look at this map." I think it's implied that she found the map while they were rescuing Chopper outside of the model world. But if it was a blueprint for use by the giant, then why is the map to human scale unless it was designed to be used as part of the RPG? I don't know at the moment, the whole map thing is a bit clunky. But I guess it tells us that we'll be spending some more time in Legoland. Unless this is a scale model of Elbaph and this map goes on to be useful on the actual island. But look, I could see the next chapter opening up with something like the Sun God rolling a d20 to determine exactly what action they take to stop the Straw Hats, because there are definite game elements at play here. Game elements that the rest of our crew are sadly missing out on. I'm 80% sure that the Sun God is a woman. The slim silhouette, the high heels, I'll even make a prediction. I think it's Freya. So Freya is a goddess associated with love, beauty. So Freya is a goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, sex, war, and some funky specific magic for seeing into the future side, if you will. So that's a lot of things. But Freya is also strongly associated with cats, rabbits, and some other cool animals. And cats, rabbits, and some other cool animals are exactly what we've been seeing so far. Some of the animals even have names. The raven we saw is named Mugen, which is a combination of Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin. I'm probably mispronouncing all of this because I am not a Norse mythology, and I apologize in advance. This is not my area. But the snake we see is named Hjulmunganda, which I believe is a reference to Jormungr, the world serpent. And someone has told me that this is potentially a portmanteau with the Swedish word hjul, which means shelf. So what we have is a shelf snake or a shelf world serpent. So these pets have very cutesy names, and it's kind of like having a small black cat and naming it Anubis and having it rule over your front garden. But back to Freya, she rules over this one, which is where half of all slain warriors go to rest. So our Sun God could have created a peaceful society designed to be free of all of the conflict, maybe taking in refugees that end up on Elbaph, because we know that giants aren't hugely keen on housing humans after the Big Mom incident. So Freya would be giving them a place to live in peace, which is a pretty big deal in Warland. And hey, you know what? Maybe that was the fate of Eustace Kidd, a warrior who was bested in battle by his betters, recovered from the sea, and plonked in an exhibit to peacefully live out the rest of his days. But how come Zoro didn't get lost this chapter? He said he followed a loud sound to his source and found Luffy and Sanji. So Zoro's sense of direction isn't quite that bad. We've seen him follow loud noises before and actually get to the places where the noises were coming from. It's only a problem when you say something like, okay, Zoro, it's easy, just go north, or just go straight, or just go anywhere that requires him to actually think about the direction himself, rather than following a sound like a predatory instinct. That's generally Zoro's problem. He's distracted by other stimuli far too easily, like an overly active puppy, but without the trained recall. One thing I noticed is that Luffy actually has his straw hat on his back. Yes, that is very much worth pointing out. One of the big things that made me think that this may not have been Luffy was, one, the gear attack dialogue made no sense, still makes no sense, but two, he didn't have his straw hat. And in the previous chapter, we did see a shot of him from behind, and there was no hat, there was no axe, there was no sword in that shot either. But in this chapter, it looks like Oda and his assistants have gotten their act together, because we do have a shot of Luffy from behind where he has both the straw hat and the axe. I'm still not 100% sold on the mistakes being accidental. However, the evidence in this chapter certainly suggests that they were. Y'all remember those non-canon arcs the anime made back in the day? It feels somewhat like we're back on those. I agree. Ever since Nami woke up in the Lego castle, this whole thing has felt like an anime filler arc. Especially because it's such a stupid reason how we got here in the first place. The whole drinking of the green fairy on the way to Elbaph causing an unexpected and weird side adventure. And I'm not sure how the anime staff think these days, but if this were classic One Piece, then I think they'd be rubbing their hands together and seeing Lego World as an opportunity to milk an entire filler arc out of. Have Luffy, Nami, Sanji, Zoro, Usopp, and Chopper meeting the residents of Legoland, solving some mundane problems for them, maybe fighting a few more gods, and then 5 to 10 episodes later is when Luffy shatters the mirror and we get back to the canon story. How many of Usopp's lies will come true in this arc? That is a very good question, and there's one lie in particular that I'm thinking of, which is when he said that he once fought 10 giants the size of the shadows they saw near Jaya. I was actually convinced that this one was going to come true during Wano when Oda introduced the numbers, because there were 10 of them, and they were artificially created ancient giants. However, Usopp did not get to manifest that lie during the raid, but how many better opportunities could there be to fight against 10 giants than on Elbaph? All of Usopp's lies do eventually manifest in one way or another, so on this, we shall wait. I feel like the quote giant is not a real giant and they're just a normal sized human. I think they have the shrink fruit or something. It makes sense since there's no giant as big as them. They're bigger than oars. Yeah, the size is pretty wild, but the shrink fruit, that is a thing that actually exists and it was used by a giant twice actually, just neither time in canon. It was called the Mini no Mi, and it was first used by a giant named Blue in a very old game, One Piece Round the Land for the PlayStation 2. But this exact same devil fruit then appeared in the Zed's Ambition filler arc, the weird tie-in episodes for Film Zed, and it was used by Lily Enstomark, a giant who could use her abilities to become not a giant. This power was also able to affect any objects that Lily was holding, but it was never used on other people. So something like this definitely isn't out of the question, because we're not dealing with a normal giant here, and if we are, then we're not dealing with the normal crew sizes here. Or we are, and the art is just as weird. And Nami mentioning gigantification could be a bit of a red herring trying to obscure what's going on by planting the exact opposite concept in our heads to think about. And I have also seen it suggested that the sun god may have a giant fruit, and a giant with a giant fruit already exists as well, except in canon because that's what San Juan Wolf has, the Decadeconomy, which allows him to transform into the colossal battleship he is. I don't think it's that option though, because all of the interiors in this building are built to the scale of the sun god. So whatever's happening here, the only constant is that the sun god is their normal size. Can we please talk about Chopper is being in an awesome collar and his awesome armor? Yeah, sure thing, we can talk about that. One of the things that I really wish we got in this chapter was a clear shot of Chopper's outfit. My artist has done an amazing job, but Chopper didn't get a clear showcase panel like the rest of the crew have had so far. But for now, what I will say is that I love his horn extensions. Unlike everyone else, Chopper came into the Viking realm already equipped with horns, but the sun god saw those and thought, good start, but we can do better. Dudes, remember when early this year Oda said something about an unexpected result from a battle between two crucial characters? He did say that, and I'd actually forgotten about this, and I shouldn't have, because we are now heading to the end of the year. It's October, and we realistically have less than 10 chapters left for this year. The current estimation is that with the breaks, we will end on chapter 1136. But last year, Oda's Jump Festa message for the manga stated, and I quote, "The battle between that character and that character may lead to unexpected results." And this was said as a teaser for what was coming up in the manga this year. And these are usually pretty on point and often outright blatant spoilers, because in this message, Oda also practically confirms that we'd be going to Elbaph after Egghead Island. I mean, he referred to it in the same way that he refers to everything as, quote, that island. But that has now come true. However, the fight teaser still hasn't come to fruition. I don't think anything's happened this year that really fits that teaser. The initial speculation was that Oda was talking about Shanks and Blackbeard, or something else happening in the background, because he usually uses words like that character and that island for things that aren't present in the current arc. And at the moment, I think the only thing that might fit is Shanks versus Bartolomeo, although that was definitely a less than unexpected outcome, but there is another possibility. Sometimes what happens is that Oda overestimates his production, and he drops spoilers a bit too early, likely because he gets a bit overly ambitious in what he'll be able to accomplish for the year. So I would maybe keep this in mind for next year, because I don't know if we're going to be cutting back to grand scale events events anytime soon, after just starting a new arc and having roughly 8 chapters left in the year. No idea what is going on. Last 3 chapters feel like a waste, considering that we only get around 30 chapters a year. I think that's a fair enough opinion. And this is also a very common feeling that I always see happen at the start of every arc, which I kind of forget about. The first few chapters of every arc is about establishing the new location and generally having fun and exploring the atmosphere instead of plowing forward with the story, which is very important because if we don't get these sorts of chapters, then everything's going to feel extremely rushed, and it becomes a question of what's even the point of being here. If Oda isn't allowed to draw all of his whimsical things, then he doesn't have a lot of reason to continue making One Piece. So these sorts of chapters may not be a hit with a certain part of the One Piece fanbase, but these are Oda's reason for existing. He's at his happiest when he can just let go and draw weird things for the sake of it. But I want to emphasize that this is the exact same sentiment as when Wano started. There was big disappointment from what I think is a very vocal minority of the fanbase, but there was a sense that we were finally on Wano and well, nothing was happening because we were spending chapters exploring the island and meeting characters like Hold'em and Urashima. People were just so keen to get to the meat of the arc that they felt a bit let down by those early chapters. And even recently, the same thing happened on Egghead Island. And the same was true of Whole Cake Island and Dressrosa as well. As much as I love these chapters because it feels great to be just messing around with the crew for a bit, I do sympathize because the annual chapter production is decreasing year after year. I think it was much easier to appreciate these arc openings back in the days of Dressrosa, Whole Cake Island, and Wano because we had more chapters per year back then. So if you weren't vibing with them that week, it's fine because we'll be moving on soon enough. But I think the increased amount and the increased length of breaks have made One Piece feel like a very scarce resource that fans want to maximize as much as possible every week because there is always a break waiting around the corner. This goes back to me always describing One Piece as being like a drug. It is a story so good that people do genuinely get addicted. So there's that existing itch that's being scratched less and less. And I myself had a bit of trouble getting into the chapter this week. However, that's more because Hunter x Hunter has returned to weekly Shonen Jump this week and did drop an incredible bombshell of a chapter to kick things off, which you can check out on my second channel, New World Review, which also has a full 2-hour recap of all of the Dark Continent and Succession Contest events for Hunter x Hunter. There's very exciting stuff happening, and you can check it all out through the link in the description. This is not the answer I expected. I don't even know exactly what it is that I was expecting, but I know that it was not this. The false sun god has been unmasked, and it turns out we've actually met this man before, several times before actually. He's been in a cover story, he was actually in the Whole Cake Island arc, and it's even implied that he may have been involved during the Egghead Island arc. So he's much more familiar than you may initially think, and we'll dive into this man and why he's doing all of these terrible, terrible things. But we have to start with the cover story, because this was just adorable seeing Tama training to become the bewitching kunoichi that Ace inspired her to be. And you can see that she's training quite hard because she's covered in bandages and band-aids. But what I love most about this is the location. We are in Amigasa Village. And that is such a hard hit of nostalgia because it's the first proper Wano location that we got to explore. And I really am starting to feel quite fond of the old Wano because it was 6 years ago that we first discovered this lovely little village. And it's definitely taken a while, but I think I'm finally gearing up to properly reread Wano. I've been back to certain parts of it quite frequently, but going through the whole thing in one go, it's just, after spending 4 years on Wano, I really feel like I needed to leave that behind for a bit, but I think it's finally time. And I loved seeing Tama here because this is my personal theory for the end of One Piece. Luffy's gonna become the Pirate King, initiate whatever the dawn of the world is, achieve his true dream, and then vanish. Whether that's because he dies in some sort of Will of D manner, or whether he does something like disappear into the unknown on an endless adventure. Either way, I think he's gonna have a Roger-style influence on those who remain, and specifically the kids that he's met and inspired over the course of One Piece. And we're gonna see all of these kids having grown up and embarking on their own adventures, getting to see the world and becoming the protagonist of their own stories that we'll never see. So this cover page is a glimpse into the future of that world. Someday Tama will be a world-renowned name. Back to matters at hand though, this is starting to become a bit of a joke now, but Yamato still hasn't started investigating that little issue of all of the missing people. In fact, no one has, not even Ino Arashi, the daimyo of Kuri, seems to care. So maybe we'll get some sort of Yamato-Tama team up to solve this here mystery, or maybe we'll just keep ignoring it until they abduct someone important. And even then, I don't know, because we've got delicious food to eat. Priorities, mate. Although speaking of eating, I don't mean to sound rude, but did you notice that Shinobu is a little bit different on this cover? Potentially due to indulging in a little bit too much Wano cuisine? I think a lot of people are going to forget this, but after the fight with Green Bull, Shinobu became really thin because he drained all of her body fat or whatever the explanation was. But on this cover page, she's back to her larger design. And I do think that this may potentially be an error, because in chapter 1115, we cut to Wano during the Egghead Island message, and we see both Shinobu and Tama, with Shinobu still very much in thin mode. Which also brings up the question of exactly where in the timeline these Yamato events take place, because we now have Tama and Shinobu both in the Flower Capital and in Amigasa Village. So I don't know, this one's not as bad as all of the art errors in the first Legoland chapter, and it will probably be explained that Shinobu preferred her larger form, or that she ate a very big breakfast that morning in an SBS segment down the line. But it could feasibly be Oda simply forgetting what he did with her. The dude has over 1,000 characters to manage, so I guess that happens from time to time. Or even with old characters, especially when starting new arcs apparently. I maintain that the best part of One Piece is experiencing a thrill of adventure from the comfort of your own living situation. Stepping into the complete unknown at the beginning of every arc and being blown away by whatever the crap it is that Oda sees fit to include in his fictional pirate world. Alright, the first thing that we need to mention about this chapter proper is of course high heels. I got a couple of comments in last week's video stating that I should not have assumed that the sun god was a woman just because of the heels, and those comments were correct. Because we've rather easily and without any actual effort unmasked the false sun god in this chapter, and it was Road, whose official English name is Rodo. I'm not entirely sure why, because it's the same spelling as the katakana would be for saying the English word road, and it's the exact same way that the word road in road poneglyph is spelt in Japanese, katakana and all. So I don't know what happened there, but as a result, most people just call him Road. I mean, I say most people. Let's be clear here. Most people have never had a reason to bring Road up in discussion, much less try and figure out how his name is actually said. However, you may remember, but probably don't remember, that he was one of the new giant warrior pirates led by Harudin. The reason why you may not remember them is because Road was introduced in the Grand Fleet cover story, because these guys have been in the actual manga, but in very cameo appearances. You can actually see the new giant warrior pirates in Vegapunk's flashback, salvaging all of the books on Ohara, although you cannot see Road there. As far as I'm aware, it's just Harudin, Gerd, and Goldberg, although Road could have feasibly been on the island as well. But Road actually makes his first appearance in the series as a baby during Big Mom's flashback, and he was actually shown in the anime. However, he appears by name only in the manga. And they mention that Road was born at roughly the same time as Prince Loki. So I wonder if there's any significance to them being born in the same year. Maybe Loki is a classic hero monarch that we need to help, and Road is like the Draco Malfoy to his Harry Potter. But when we cut to Road's only proper appearance in the manga, which is the cover story, and scan down, our boy has those sweet, sweet high heels, which I think of everyone teching actually predicted, so good on him. But all of that was a very roundabout way of saying that I will never make assumptions about high heels again. It is definitely surprising the way that this revelation happens though. Usually Oda reveals the answers to these masked and silhouetted figures in a bit more dramatically. Instead, we cut to a very basic flashback with the answer that Road's bird friend picked up the Sunny and brought it to what I think, or at the very least I hope, is actually Elbaph. But I'm not a huge fan of what happened here. The whole idea that the ship went through this new sleep mist area that we never got to see. Because even after getting completely smashed, you would think that the Giants would know to avoid this sort of area. And in the end, it sounds again like a lame setup for a filler arc. And you know what? It was exactly that with the Rainbow Mist filler arc. I'm a bit conflicted here because I do really like how this arc began with Nami simply waking up in a strange world and using that as a vehicle to get our first steps onto the island, dealing with something manageable to human scale and then expanding outwards. But I do think that how we got to this point is a bit weak, and it feels like flailing for narrative excuses, bringing in both the Green Fairy and the Sleeping Mist into it. It feels that one step too convoluted. So this is not Oda's best transitional work in my opinion, but he is setting up what looks like could be the heart of the Elbaph conflict. Because in this chapter, Road goes on a bit of a Hody Jones-Arlong-esque rant about the superiority of giants and his general disgust at the idea of being a subordinate of a mere human. Yuck. If I'm gonna be a subordinate of a human, at least make it a clown. And this has made me think that we've been quite lucky when it's come to meeting giants. We have Dory, Broggy, Oimokashi, Harudin, in fact, you know what, add Soul to the giant pile as well. They've all been quite down to earth, which is very impressive because they're so high up. But something I really loved about Dory and Broggy in particular on Little Garden is that they were not at all dismissive of the Straw Hats. There was nothing even approaching a sense of racial disparity. All there was the recognition of fellow warriors and travelers. There was a point where Dory even asked Luffy if he wanted to fight for the eternal pose to Elbaph. And he didn't do that as a joke, he did it as a show of respect to Luffy and as a show of humbleness of Dory. They were even showing respect to Usopp. So even though the Elbaph culture does focus greatly on personal strength, it seems that most of the giants don't let that personal strength go to their heads. Now it should be said that all of these have been older giants from the era over a century ago, and attitudes may have changed as we see with Road, because I highly doubt that he's the only giant that feels this way. He's just the first to make himself known to us. So Elbaph looks like it could be split down the middle in regards to human sentiment. Because we have also seen a lot of giants who were happy to spend time with Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates. It wasn't just the old giant warrior pirates, but historically we do know that there have been tensions between giants and humans, and getting involved with humans rarely seems to end well for them. I imagine there's also quite a bit of lingering resentment there. The fact that these tiny, fragile, itty-bitty beings are in charge of the world and keeping us giant folk isolated in our territory, like the fishmen being kept underwater. So even though he is a member of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, I don't know if Road is necessarily going to end up as our ally here, if only because it seems difficult for him to narratively recover from this position, because he's doing some pretty messed up stuff. At this point, it would be kind of like adding Absalom to the Grand Fleet, if he was alive. But if he was alive and we added him, But also, throughout this chapter, Oda portrays Road as quite deranged. And I don't know how this is going to be done in the official translation. This is going to be interesting, actually. But Road addresses the Straw Hats with an honorific that we don't often see in anything, being Tasso. Now, I wasn't familiar with this term before looking into it for this chapter, but this is apparently a suffix widely used in otaku culture, specifically in regards to someone's oshi, meaning a person that they support or a person they're a big fan of. Like how Bartolomeo was a big fan of Luffy and the Straw Hats, but even then he addresses the crew as senpai instead of Tasso. Tasso is also used for almost exclusively female characters, celebrities, idols, etc. So the use of this word is basically telling us that Road is going to be a degree creepier than Bartolomeo was, which we definitely see in regards to Nami, because as much as Road looks down on the weak, fragile bodies of the male Straw Hat members, he happens to be very impressed with Nami's body. And for me personally, I think this is going to be difficult for him to come back from, because the idea is not only that he drugged and stripped Nami, but also that he very much enjoyed doing it. What I can't quite figure out is if Oda is trying to play Road as creepy or play it as a gag, because I could see it going either way. Because Oda does use this as an excuse to draw a really funny Sanji face, and it's not as if Nami's bothered by any of this, although historically she's quite unfazed by stuff like this. I find it pretty creepy though, and if nothing else, I do think that Oda has very much succeeded in portraying a different sort of otaku to Bartolomeo, because Road is the kind of guy that we've all met, we know he's a bit off, and wouldn't be surprised to find out that he's keeping humans in his roleplay dungeon, which is an actual dungeon by the way. This was an old prison cell for giants, so that is an added layer of creepiness here. And at the moment, Road's giving me those Archie vibes, but combined with a hint of the morbid artistry of Little Garden Galdino. Because our Road, he is a storyteller. He's very exciting that something organic and rather epic is happening in his diorama, and he really is verging on the delusion of God. Having mentioned Archie and Galdino, I also see a lot of NL in Road, because his view of humanity is so low that he justifies them being his playthings. And I wouldn't be surprised if this sun god business isn't just for show, and Road actually believes himself to be the god of his own personal world here. There's definitely something not quite right with this boy. However, it was very satisfying to see him get struck by Nami at the end of the chapter. And I actually don't think that the art does the scale of this attack justice. What Nami did here was call down an NL-sized blast, and it was incredible. It was also the best possible solution for Oda, because revealing the sun god to be Road is a bit underwhelming to say the least, because you immediately know that he's not a real threat. Luffy took down his Captain Haradin using just Gear's second on Dressrosa, so Road was never going to be threatening to Luffy, let alone a full monster trio. However, it is a great opportunity to showcase Nami. Road's not a threat to Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, but being able to fight a giant is a huge achievement for Nami. And this may be the same old wishful thinking as always, but I'm wondering if Usopp is watching this and thinking to himself, damn, even Nami can fight giants now? I gotta get this long nose out of my butt and onto the battlefield. To be completely fair, Usopp had a great moment in this chapter as well. His skull bomb grasp was colossal, on an even bigger scale than Nami's thunder actually. It just it didn't really do anything. But this was a very strong Nami chapter, because there was also that moment where she instantly memorized the map of Legoland and just threw it away, which I appreciated because Nami's dream feels like it's gotten a bit lost over time. We almost never focus on drawing maps or even Nami's skill with reading and absorbing maps. So this was one of those moments where we see a childhood of slaving over making thousands of maps for Arlong coming back to help us. And also I should mention that Road is the navigator of the new giant warrior pirates. So what we have in this chapter is a very rare navigator v navigator matchup. And in the end, I think Luffy's judgment of the situation tells me that this is probably just going to be taken as a fun little side quest. Road, he's a strange man, but whatever. Because as odd as he comes off, Luffy doesn't seem overly concerned with anything that's happening here. And he even had that moment of asking Iskat to be more careful about not destroying the diorama, because he could see that Road had put a lot of work into it. More importantly, we finally have an explanation for that Gear 4th error, which is no longer an error, it was intentional. It would appear that Luffy has evolved once more and that he can now use Gear 4th techniques in select parts of his body without having to assume the full form, which I I have to admit looked pretty damn cool in the way that he used it in this chapter. The only thing I feel is a bit of a shame is that with this power, there's now never really any reason to use Gear 3rd again. It's a completely defunct gear now, because Gear 4th can do everything it can, just better and at seemingly no cost. But then again, I do really appreciate the idea of evolution, and the concept of, yeah, it's okay to retire techniques, especially over such a long-running series. Because this is the thought I have every time Goku uses a Kamehameha again. Because it's like, mate, you've been using the same attack for almost genuinely half a century now, and it hasn't scaled very well. Use other things, you got other things. And with Luffy, this all goes back to his general idea of freedom. After accessing Gear 5th, his Devil Fruit has awakened, and I like that we're seeing that trickle down to the fruit as a whole rather than just Gear 5th. Luffy now has more freedom than ever before with all of his attacks. He's becoming more efficient, more versatile, and he's having the time of his life whilst doing it. And at the end of this chapter, we have Luffy using his little Gear 4th to bust through a wall designed to hold giants, so that's pretty cool. And I think it's Usopp who's praying and says, please be Elbaph on the outside, which I think very much encapsulates the voices of the fans at the moment. What we're doing here, it's fun and all, and I have no doubt that these chapters are going to be great to blast through in a volume format, but I really am getting that Elbaph itch, and with the kind of meh reveal of who the false sun god actually is, the amount of time that I want to keep spending in the diorama world is pretty much zero, so here's hoping that our adventure will begin in earnest next week. Where did Usopp get that nuke from, and how come he hasn't used it till now? I'm very glad you mentioned that, because he has used it before. It was just an extremely long time ago. It was during Fishman Island when he and Chopper reformed the Alabasta Dream Team to fight against Daruma and Dosen, and it is such an epic looking attack. I think the word epic is incredibly overused, but this warrants it, because this is Usopp dropping a plant nuke, and I have no idea why he doesn't use this more often. Or for that matter, most of the moves that he whipped out on Fishman Island, like the Impact Wolf, Make That Wolf was so cool, or any of the other amazing situational technical pop greens, because Usopp has an answer to every question. But after Fishman Island, Oda just hasn't posed Usopp a lot of questions to answer. Apart from beating Sugar on Dressrosa, which really was more comedy focused, apart from that, I still think that Usopp has yet to shine brighter than he did on Fishman Island. Punk Hazard was fairly uneventful for him. He took a bit of a vacation during Whole Cake Island. He got the least love of any Straw Hat by far on Wano, and Egghead didn't really give him anything to work with either. So hopefully Elbaph is this opportunity. One Piece fans, finally Usopp gets stronger in this arc. Meanwhile, Oda, but I like Nami more. Honestly, I'll take either one. I think that Nami has been quite neglected as well. And also Chopper. So here is my Elbaph proposal. We're on the island of strong battle strength, so wouldn't it be cool if this arc focused mostly on the weakling trio? On this island of raw power, what we get to highlight were Nami, Usopp, and Chopper, and how their own personal strength can compete with and complement the raw strength possessed by the Luffys, the Zoros, and the Sanjais of the world. Sort of like what happened in One Piece Stampede. Before I said that Usopp hasn't really shined particularly brightly since Fishman Island, but there is an exception. It's this movie. Stampede was his movie. The premise was gathering all of the most powerful people in the world to fight against Douglas Bullet, and the person most responsible for ultimately defeating Bullet was Usopp. By far the physically weakest person of the island caused the downfall of the strongest, and that is the sort of stuff I love. It's not about Usopp receiving some sort of powerful god hammer and owning falls left, right, center, up and down, forwards, backwards, and always twirling towards freedom. That's not who Usopp, Nami, or Chopper are. And this also takes me back to Enies Lobby, where Sanji saved Usopp from Jabra, and his words were, "I'll do what you can't, and you do what I can't." What we need to explore is that can actually, what Usopp can do, and to try and extract it, to bring that out in its most potent form, to give him that almost Gear 5th level of sniper freedom. I think we should stop making theories based on height. The last one aged very horribly. Alright, it's a good thing I've got my affairs in order, because I'm now going to proceed to die on this hill. The height and scaling in general so far has been ridiculous. For example, take this lovely shot of Iskat knocking Nami and Usopp out of Big Stein Castle. I love this panel because Oda so rarely uses that abundance of negative space these days, but that is not the point. The point is that Iskat fits in this castle quite comfortably. Meanwhile, we have this chapter, and Iskat is pretty much the exact same size as the entirety of Big Stein Castle itself, and don't you even try to tell me that this is perspective. It's not. It's quite a small world. The castle is right there. It's not far off into the distance. And before this chapter, that cat fit in those rooms very comfortably. Just look at all the headroom that Iskat has here. Ah, what luxury. And it's the same thing for Rode and the Straw Hats. The sizing is very inconsistent. Like Rode's workshop, we see this area and there's a door into the diorama that he would barely fit into. He definitely need to duck at the very least, and look, there's a bit more headroom in the diorama itself, but not much, right? Because we can see the roof. But then we cut to some panels within the diorama where this room is like 3 times Rode's height. So look, in conclusion, the commenter is correct. We must immediately stop using height and size in general as any sort of metric for anything. At least for the duration of Elbaph, because Oda prioritizes art over logistics. As he should, quite frankly. Although I have to say that while the art errors have gotten better, they are still present, like this panel where Usopp is missing his beard and his mustache. It's not a huge deal, in fact it took my thumbnail artist to point this out to me, but the frequency in which these small errors are happening are on a scale previously unseen in One Piece. And speaking of my thumbnail artist, I have a message for her husband, Hugh. You know who you are, Hugh. I've been told to tell you to pick up some Ben & Jerry's chocolate fudge brownie ice cream on the way home, and the reason why I've been told to tell you this is because your wife says that you listen to my videos more than her voice, which honestly, I appreciate. The panel with the villagers talking about escaping really stood out to me. I'm so curious what their story is. Another brilliant comment by an even more brilliant channel member. See that shiny gold thing? That indicates a person of great intellect and undoubtedly pleasant aesthetic qualities. And you too could be one of these by becoming a channel member. But back to these villager dudes. I skipped over this in the review because I was so focused on Rode being a weirdo. But the other inhabitants of Legoland are very much confirmed to be there against their will. They are being forced to act in this RPG, which in this case does not stand for role-playing game. No. This is a Rode-playing game. I stole that from one of my commenters. You know who you are. No one else does, but you and I know. But this makes things so much worse. It reminds me of Buggy forcing the Orangetown villagers to be his permanent audience in live-action One Piece, or if you're a Hunter x Hunter fan, then the idea of how Greed Island works, where the convicted felons were forced to be game NPCs, and they did exactly as they were told, otherwise Razor would blow their heads off. It's all quite twisted, and I guess their story is that Rode's bird friend has been scooping up pirates sailing around Elbaph and forcing them to be part of his fantasy world, where Rode gets to be in control for the first and possibly only time in his life, because he's probably a loser in real-life fictional pirate world. But here's something that might be a bit controversial. Oda could be using Rode to make fun of himself, because we have the maniacal storyteller building his extensive story world, and Oda has been known to be quite emotive in the studio. His assistants often catch him cackling to himself if he's drawing something funny, for example. And also, Oda does have something of a Nami obsession. I'll never not bring this up, but he married the actress who played Nami at the Jump Festa live show, so look, what we could be seeing in Rode is a lot of Oda himself. Harudin felt pretty superior to Luffy too before he got one-shot by him, so that's a very good point. After reading this chapter, I went back to Harudin's bits on Dressrosa, and he actually displays some very Rode-like qualities, minus the human fetish. Harudin's reason for participating in the Corridor Coliseum was to acquire the Merimero no Mi and become the, quote, king of the giants, which is, it's really interesting. It makes me wonder if he was planning on overthrowing Loki in the Elbaph monarchy. There's definitely a sense of generational dissatisfaction here, because Harudin, much like Rode is here, was extremely arrogant, and shocked that anyone would dare challenge him, big giant man, all before he got put in his place by Luffy, Harudin's place in this case being on the floor. However, that wasn't the moment of change. That moment came when Harudin was turned into a toy, an adorable little elephant, and with all of his size, his strength, and other raw measurements of superiority stripped of him, Harudin had to rely on the weaker Straw Hat to save him. And that's what changed Harudin's views on strength. Whereas Rode still has yet to have that kind of experience, because this really is a tale of youth. Young adults come out of high school and university with what they feel are very solid and unshakable beliefs in whatever they've been raised in, be it politics, religion, other social issues, and whatever. Doesn't matter what it is, what matters is that it's usually seen in terms of black and white. There is a correct answer and there is an incorrect answer. And then as you get older, as I continue to do, things get less clear, the world becomes more complicated, and you've got to seek deeper answers. And you've got got to confront the fact that things are painfully nuanced. Road right now, he's at the beginning of that journey. He's a very young giant man. And so to him, giant superiority is the clear answer, just as it once was to Haradin. But maturity is knowing that things aren't that simple, which we see in all of our older gents, Dory, Rocky, Oimo, and Kashi. They've all had these experiences already, which is why each and every one of them showed so much respect to Usopp, because looks are very deceiving and you can't make these black and white judgments. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure what the reason for the map was. The crew already knew to just basically run in the other direction, and they would hit another wall to bust through. So, if, as I'm hoping, they leave the Lego world in the next chapter, it does bring up the question of why bother to find the map in the first place. But I think the answer to that is it's an easy excuse for exposition. Because in this sort of situation, Oda wants to explain the environment, and I personally also want him to explain the environment. And there's only a couple of ways you can do that when Road himself isn't likely to provide it. So what we're doing here, it's sort of like watching Breaking the Magician's Code or something. They show you the illusion, and then they show you the engineering of how it was accomplished. That's what's happening here. We woke up in a magical, impossible wonderland, and now we're deconstructing that illusion, showing you all of the engineering behind it, possibly to make this world feel as small as possible before breaking into Elbaph properly and experiencing the true magic of the real island. And I quite liked reducing this whole realm to what is essentially some edgy kid's bedroom. That's the impression I got from the bird's eye view of the map anyway. Because I used to build little Lego cities and stuff like that in my room when I was a kid. And were it socially acceptable, I'd do it again. Road ain't deranged, he's a Warhammer fan. Look, as a Warhammer fan, let me tell you this. Claiming to be a Warhammer fan is not an effective defense against anything, and will generally only incriminate you further. I don't think they actually went through any sleeping mist. I think they were knocked from absinthe, but Road wouldn't have any way of knowing that. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if it matters. It's all a bit too convoluted. Oda's introduced the drunkenness, the hallucinations, and now the sleeping mist. So look, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think any of this was particularly planned out. We've explored Oda's tendency to improvise in a lot of other videos, but what we tend to do is highlight the moments of pure genius rather than the moments of not that. And this, I think, is one of those moments. He knew where he was and he knew where he wanted to go, but this feels like a series of last-minute thoughts to fill in those gaps, which is why the explanation keeps changing. Again, I could be wrong. Perhaps the mist and the absinthe going to come back as a very important plot point, but at the moment I think they're the result of the best Oda could come up with on short notice. I mean, I don't know, here's one attempt to explain it. Maybe it was both the absinthe and the mist. It was a combination of the two that caused this, because maybe the sleeping mist hangs so low that it doesn't affect the big mighty giant ships, so everyone aboard the giant warrior pirates vessel wasn't affected. They were affected by the alcohol but not the mist, but everyone aboard the Thousand Sunny was affected by both the mist and the alcohol. So half the crew got completely smashed and half the crew got drugged by the mist, and that's how both of these devices play into where we are now. Which would be a kind of cool feature, I guess. The fact that Warland has this protective sleeping mist making Elbaph that much harder to invade, at least from a specific angle. Because to the best of our knowledge, Eustace Kid did not encounter the mist. So the mist may only exist in the direction facing Egghead Island and not Wano. Luffy didn't turn old after Gear 5 this time. No, he didn't. He quite successfully activated Gear 5th and then switched back to normal. I think that may be because he only used it for such a short amount of time. On the other occasions where we've seen him become a shriveled prune on Wano and Egghead, this was because he ran out of stamina, or whatever it is that Gear 5th drains from him. Haki, willpower, come. I don't think it's like old school Gear 3rd where it makes Luffy tiny no matter what. If he doesn't push himself too hard, I think that Luffy has the freedom to flick this on and off. Personally, I think Shinobu might just be trying to make herself look fat to avoid having anyone try to kidnap her. I don't know, I don't think that works though, because Shinobu has the Alvida effect going on. She believes that she is just as, if not much more attractive in this larger form, and anyone who disagrees gets thwacked in the sack. So if she was trying to avoid being captured, then maybe staying thin is the way to go, from her perspective anyway. Did you see the cover for chapter 898 and the title of the chapter? Do you think this was intentional by Oda or just coincidental storytelling? I did see it, and I think it's the second one. Road was first shown to us on the cover of chapter 898 as stated, and the chapter title was I Will Return, which takes place just after Luffy beats Katakuri and he and Sanji return to the Thousand Sunny. Now some people are trying to say that Oda purposely used Road on this cover as some sort of huge foreshadowing that he'll be back, but I don't think so. The thing about One Piece is that no matter which character appeared on this cover page with this title, you could make an argument for it being foreshadowing. So since it was during the Grand Fleet cover cover story, specifically the giant part. Let's say it was Gerd, Goldberg, or Stanson on this cover. It doesn't matter which one it is, people would have brought up this exact thing when we saw Gerd and Goldberg during the Egghead arc. They would have gone, oh, foreshadowing Gerd on the chapter, I'll be back, Oda. Genius. So I think this is one of the moments where the fan base is just digging a bit too deep. Everything so far is happening too fast. I believe that if we truly have started Elbaph, then Oda has cut his ideas to the bare minimum. See, that's an interesting comment because I've also seen the exact opposite. That everything's happening too slowly in the last chapters that felt like a complete waste of time. What's going on, Oda, bruh? And I can see both perspectives because we did really blast through this initial Elbaph stuff. Oda set up and solved a mystery within the space of a single chapter. And again, I go back to Wano with stuff like this. Act 1 felt both really slow and really fast because we were blasting through stuff at quite the rapid pace, but said stuff was events like Luffy versus Orochima. So it felt like not a lot of deep progress was being made. But it is, we're building ourselves up. We don't just rock up to the island and sock the main antagonist in the nuts out of nowhere. We take our time to work up the hierarchy a bit and discover what some of the intrinsic issues of the island are, like this giant superiority business. I suppose in this case, the intrinsic issue is that Elbaph clearly doesn't have enough focus on mental health programs because our road has been left behind and gone down quite a dark path. But also in regards to the feeling that we're moving quite slowly or quite quickly, I think that part of this is because we were just spoiled by Egghead Island. Going back to the early Egghead chapters, Oda wasn't messing around. It genuinely went like this. Chapter 1, Jewelry Bonnie. Chapter 2, Vegapunk. Chapter 3, Rob Lucci. And Chapter 4, Blackbeard versus Law. You see what I mean? There are bombshells just dropped in every single chapter right from the get-go. But you compare that to Elbaph and it's like Chapter 1, Cat. Chapter 2, Dear Skull, and Chapter 3, Big Ol' Pervert. Egghead Island really grabbed us by the balls and refused to let go for 2 whole years. And because it's now been 6 years since the beginning of Wano, I feel like a lot of us have forgotten what the standard beginning of a One Piece arc feels like. It feels like this. And I get that that can come off as a little bit slow reading weekly, but I'm personally really glad that we are over 1,100 chapters into One Piece, and Oda still feels comfortable taking little side trips like this. For the phenomenal experience that Egghead Island was, it really did feel like One Piece was ending imminently, and just thinking about my selfish perspective, that's not a thing that I look forward to happening. So I'm more than happy to go down as many dark story alleys as narrative drug dealer Eiichiro Oda wants to usher me down. Oda has just revealed a figure truly worthy of the title of Lurking Legend, who may very well be by far Luffy's greatest challenge to date, and whose very existence could cause the beginning of the end of the One Piece world. At the moment, not enough eyes are on Elbaph. The world thinks that this big prophesized final war is going to be a clash between pirates, marines, and revolutionaries, but the true beginning of Ragnarok seems to be staring us right in the face with an unnervingly familiar smile and an even more familiar title being the Sun God. But there's a big difference between Loki and everyone else who has ever called themselves a god in One Piece, which is that when it comes to Loki, I actually believe him. We're starting this chapter with some pretty bad news though. Although this was news that I would say was fairly predictable. I mean, I can't count the amount of times that I said the world government are going to blame Vegapunk's death on Luffy, but they didn't accomplish this alone. We do need to point out that all of this is because Big News Morgan's already decided that Luffy was going to be the villain of this story, and he did so before the Egghead Siege even took place. And this is one of those situations where you can see a lot of Oda in Morgan's because he's constructing the news to tell the most compelling story. And things are gonna be real boring if the truth gets out there and the whole world just supports Luffy. And there is a bit of a trend happening here because Morgan slandered Sabo as well for the Cobra incident. So this bird is on a warpath with these brothers, claiming that Sabo killed Cobra, Luffy killed Vegapunk, and Ace killed the idea of ever innocently enjoying a donut ever again because now I can't look at one without thinking about him. I also love the photo selection of Luffy. It's an article about essentially a pirate terrorist killing a beloved old man. And that photo of Luffy, he looks so happy about it. But the face is definitely not the major focus of that picture. One of the most curious parts of this chapter is when it's clocked that Gear 5th Luffy has an alabaster X on his arm. So I didn't realize what was happening here at first, and I started to wonder if I was going a bit crazy. I don't know, getting old now, I've been told that happens. And I was thinking to myself, mate, there's no way that this X could have been here all along, and Oda somehow just always positioned Luffy to avoid avoid showing it, sort of like how, again, all of a sudden, Emmett had an X on his arm in the flashback with Joy Boy that we didn't see on him in the modern day. But that is definitely not the case. What's happened here is almost certainly Vivi's doing. Big News Morgans is the one in charge of printing these newspapers, and I think that Vivi has either convinced him to print this photo with an X added, or Vivi has sneakily inserted an X herself without Morgans knowing. And she's done this as a way to send a message to the Straw Hats that she's alive and even telling them how to find her. Because if they do the logic math, then all they need to do is track down Big Bird. And this is where we finally get the answer as to why Oda chose the original 6 Straw Hats to go to Legoland. Because the remaining Straw Hats who see this news article were not present for this mark of fellowship and they don't know its meaning. But as soon as one of the original 6 sees this, they're going to put it together. And at some point, I think we'll be heading out to retrieve Vivi. It's quite a clever move from Vivi, and I think she may have gotten the idea from Luffy himself. Specifically when he was purposely photographed with a 3D 2Y message on his arm. Because we did see Vivi reacting to this photo, and after dismissing that it could have been some sort of fashion statement, I imagine that she was able to figure out what was being said here. Especially because the Straw Hats reunited 2 years later, so that confirms the 2Y part of the theory. Or at the very least, make it incredibly obvious what happened in retrospect. But also making big news are big men, Dory and Broggy, because their big bounties have now been raised to an even bigger 1.8 billion berries each. Not combined, each. And as things currently stand, Dory and Broggy are tied for the 13th highest bounty number in the entire series, narrowly being beaten by Sir Crocodile, who has approximately 1.9 billion, although it's a big jump after that because we have Luffy, Law, and Kid at 3 billion each. So I'm seeing a lot of absolutely flawed reactions to this, people whose heads are exploding because how can these two be worth this much? Especially considering that they were both almost killed by Galdino, the Candle Man, and as far as we know, he's still stuck at 24 million berries. But there are 2 reasons why this makes absolute sense. And the first is something I've commented about before because I never miss a chance to discuss fictional inflation. But I've always believed that Dory and Broggy have been severely undervalued by the fan base because they see 100 million berries each and they think to themselves, what trash. Every supernova we met on Sabadi was worth more than that. Giants are suck. But this is 100 million berries 100 years ago. And 100 years ago, you could buy a house for like a couple of $1,000. And so the bounty increase for Dory and Broggy is actually remarkably similar to what inflation would have done in reality. Because if you plug $100,000 into the inflation calculator starting in 1924, then today that amount would be worth 1.8 million. I did try doing 100 million, but the calculator wouldn't let me. Too big of a number. Maybe $100 million didn't exist in 1924. I don't know. But after doing that, I do genuinely think that Oda plugged these numbers into a calculator, and that's how he came up with the 1.8 billion number, because it matches pretty perfectly. Meaning that if our worst generation had been active a century ago instead of not being born yet, then their notorious rookie bounties would have been sitting somewhere around 5 to 6 million berries, which is less than the Meow Band brothers are worth in the modern day as they go for 7 million apiece. Things were much simpler back in the day, less people dressing up as cats, I imagine. But the other reason why Dory and Broggy are now worth this much is because it's been my belief that these two were always supposed to have this level of strength and notoriety. They were introduced on Little Garden with the plan of being endgame characters, and the only reason why they feel so weak is because One Piece has taken a quarter of a century longer to complete than Oda originally thought it would, and so these early characters have been a bit left in the dust in terms of power scaling. In fact, the same thing happened with Crocodile. He was always supposed to be one of the world's major threats, but because he appeared so accidentally early, his alabaster and even impel down performance doesn't really stack up to the narrative status he holds. But Dory and Broggy are meant to be a big deal, and that's why they're being treated as such, which I think makes the revelation of Loki that much more terrifying, because giants, they are no joke, but Loki makes every other giant look like a joke. And we'll get to him in a bit because, Firstly, though, some initial thoughts about Elbaph itself, because we were blessed with such a clear shot of its landscape in this chapter, and it's pretty damn magnificent. I think that this is some of Oda's finest location work, maybe even a magnum opus, because I really don't know how he's ever going to top this. It reminds me a lot of Wano when we got the first full landscape shot, which Oda has cited as his favorite drawing that he's ever done in One Piece. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, how can we spend any less than 2 years exploring this colossal island? We spent 4 years on Wano and we still never really dived too deeply into more than half the country. We got to know Onigashima, the flower capital, and I guess Kuri pretty well, but the rest of it was left very underexplored. And I don't want that for Elbaph, because what this has done is that it has furiously activated my open world senses. In fact, seeing Luffy and the other Straw Hats step outside silhouette and hop on that bridge, it was like being in Elden Ring and stepping into the mountaintops of the giants. It's also finally being confirmed that Elbaph is officially spelled with a PH, which is a win for the official translation, which has been going with that since the beginning. Although I think a bit of a loss for the fans who liked the idea of Elbaph being the spelling of Fable backwards. But what I love is that when Luffy's group actually get outside the landscape, it is massive. We're on a huge castle built on top of these grand snowy mountains, and it's like we're already at the pinnacle of what most islands could offer. But then you see the first full shot of Elbaph with a PH, and you can see that where we are, this grand landscape is right down the bottom, and it is absolutely nothing compared to the full island. And that what the maximum of any other island has to offer us is just the starting zone of Elbaph. So what Oda very effectively did here is slowly prep us for the full scale of what Elbaph is, starting with a diorama castle, then we got outside and we see a full castle, and then we see the full island, which makes the full castle feel like the diorama castle. Whatever your feelings on Road and the Lego world are, it did its job. Because I don't think it would have been effective if we just, did a bit of a sail, rocked up and saw the island. I don't think we would have gotten that full sense of scale. And something I'm very curious about is that huge sword that seems to pass through several layers of the Yggdrasil tree, because this is easily the single largest object that has ever been depicted in One Piece. Nothing else even comes close. And it raises the question of, was this built for, architectural purposes, a bit of aesthetic flair for Warland? Or was this a blade once used by a colossal ancient being? And will it be used again? Is this Chekhov's a big Viking sword? Is Luffy going to see this and think, ooh, it'd be fun to swing that around? Or does Loki have some sort of plan with it? Speaking of, we need to talk about this guy, because Loki's design is, I think, better than anyone could have predicted, because what we have happening here is a reverse One Piece. Usually what happens is we get intimidating silhouette that turns out to be a bit of a derpy character design, but here Loki was given a comical silhouette and has been revealed as what is, in my opinion, one of the hardest character designs we've ever seen in the One Piece. Loki got the full Kaido treatment. Remember that notorious silhouette of Kaido from Water 7 that transformed into one of the craziest designs in the series? And I'd also compare Loki to Katakuri just in terms of the coolness factor and the absurd amount of detail. If you're one of Oda's assistants, you've got to see a character like this and initially you're awestruck, it's beautiful and epic, but then you would surely get hit with a shot of dread as you realize that this is what you need to draw every time Loki appears in the manga. This is not an easy design to bring to life, especially with all the tattoos, because stuff like that is a nightmare to keep track of at all of the different angles that Oda likes to use. But this is yet another thing that separates One Piece from most other shonen. Very few authors are able to put in the superhuman effort to bring these sorts of designs to life. And I have to say, one of my first thoughts is that this was the man that Charlotte Lola rejected. And if I were Gotti of the Fire Tank Pirates who recently married Lola, I'd be feeling just a little bit nervous about that fact. Lola, by the way, proposed to over 4,000 people, including every male member of the Straw Hat Pirates, even Chopper and Brook. However, she only ever rejected one man, that man being Loki, who seems to be a combination of every villain we've ever faced. You can definitely detect some Doflamingo in him because of the tongue and the twisted smile. You've also got the brute rawness of Kaido, but strangest of all is that his face reminds me of a sort of Gigantamax Django. And I think there's even a bit of Doc Q in there, although I might just be saying that because of the hair. But I think it's pretty fair to speculate that what we're looking at here may be the major antagonist of this arc. That might not be how it turns out, but it probably is, because he killed his father for the sake of magical fruit, and that's a story that sounds very familiar, a bit Blackbeard-esque. So as presented to us, it sure does feel like we have quite the bad dude on our hands here, which is why Oda has gone so overboard with the design, because with new One Piece antagonists, there is no option other than to do that. Oda has an incredible and very unenviable challenge post-Wano in One Piece, which is that it is so difficult to make any antagonist seem like a threat to Luffy after Gear 5th. Even a full complement of old men on Egghead Island, I don't think ever quite got to that point. There were some pretty awesome monsters and horrifying whenever they were interacting with characters that weren't Luffy, but there was never a stage where this felt like a true challenge to Luffy. But with just one panel of Loki, I get that feeling. This 2-page spread is, I think, one of the most epic and memorable, not just this year, not even in the last few years, but probably ever, because this feels like Luffy walking into a boss battle that even he is underleveled for. And you know what it is? It's the smile. Even in this position, Loki is still grinning from ear to ear. That's not something that the Five Elders or even Kaido had going for them. They were never able to challenge Luffy on that high ideological level. They weren't able to reach Luffy's wavelength of enjoyment and freedom, and so they seriously lacked the substance to deal with him. With Loki though, he looks like he's having the time of his life. Even having been chained for however many decades it's been, I don't get the feeling that this man is unhappy with this situation. Even confined to the depths of Elbaph's snowy, hellish conditions, even here, Loki looks much more happier and feels much more free than anyone in his situation has the right to. And of course he does, because that's when we get the bombshell that Loki is yet another person who refers to himself as the sun god and a man who believes that he is destined to destroy the world. Assumedly through some sort of fictional pirate Ragnarok. But Loki terrifies me because he has that, that Luffy vibe about him. The idea that no matter what situation Luffy gets put into, if he says he's going to become the Pirate King, then I believe it. He has a willpower that transcends the page he's drawn on. And I don't know how Oda does it, but I get that same feeling from Loki. The fact that even if he's in this situation, I believe him when he says he's going to destroy the world. It really does feel like this is a person to rival Luffy's ambition and become the greatest challenge that Luffy has ever faced. And realistically, if Elbaph is going to be a full arc, then Loki would need to be. One Piece doesn't go backwards, we only ever escalate, and after an arc where we fought all 5 Elder Stars, there's not a lot of room left before we hit that ceiling. But Loki, despite his size, or perhaps even because of it, looks like he could fit in perfectly. And this may even be why Oda emphasized Luffy becoming a giant so much in Gear 5th, because he's going to need that giant form to fight and bring down Loki. And it's not lost on me that Loki currently occupies a very similar role to that of Fenrir, the great wolf who was bound and destined to remain that way until Ragnarok, after which point he will go on to kill Odin, and in some versions of the myth, it's even said that Fenrir will devour the sun itself. And I guess the question that we need to ask right now is, will Luffy free Loki and accidentally begin Ragnarok? I feel like Loki's just going to ask to be freed, and Luffy will be like, yeah, okay. So I have the same ominous feeling. That feeling that Oda's going to give us that classic One Piece subversion, where, in any other series, the beginning of an event like Ragnarok would be a pretty big deal, and would probably earn its own arc just initiating it. However, here in One Piece land, it could happen in the most mundane way possible, where Luffy just goes, yeah, sure. The only thing that gives me pause for thought here is Luffy himself, though. When it actually comes to important things, he tends to be a pretty good judge of character, and he can dissect whether someone is a good or bad person just from vibes alone. And Luffy's interaction with Loki so far seems, quite amicable. He's quite happy and eager to be having this experience, and it's strikingly similar to when he met Zoro at Shellstown. This man who had only ever been spoken about as if he was a literal demon being restrained for the good of all of those around him, but Luffy walked up to him and all he saw was a crew member. So I'm not saying that Luffy's going to ask Loki to join the crew in the very next chapter, although that would be about the most wild thing that Oda could throw at us after this. But what I am saying is that maybe, just very maybe, Loki isn't quite as evil as he's being portrayed to us currently. And maybe this whole destroying the world business depends on your interpretation. Like how right now the Revolutionary Army are trying to accomplish a very similar task by destroying the current world order. Although Loki's interpretation does feel a lot more literal at this stage, it's very difficult to picture him then going on to expand about his disdain for the ruling class. But then again, Ragnarok really was a purge of the gods, so he could definitely be heading that way. But in the case of Loki, I think it's going to take something pretty big to redeem him if everything we're hearing is true. When it comes down to it though, someone's gonna free Loki. We're not leaving this island with him still being chained up to the tree, or if we are, it'll be after we've beaten him and rechained him to the tree so that he can patiently wait for the actual end of the world. So if it's gonna happen anyway, why not make it Luffy? Could be fun. Ragnarok could be fun. And then it would give him the impetus to really get involved with the affairs of the island. But what I'm really interested in right now is the fact that Luffy felt so compelled to meet Loki. Again, in the same sort of way that he felt compelled to meet Zoro after Kobe told him about him. And the idea that Loki was exuding so much strength, or maybe not strength, but willpower, or whatever it was that appealed to Luffy, Loki produced it and he lured our Pirate King in. It was sort of like what happened when Kizaru invaded Eckert Island. Luffy immediately noticed his presence. He said, there's a strong dude over there. But Kizaru came to him. And I don't know if it's deeper than that, because very strange events concerning Luffy do happen in One Piece from time to time, where it almost seems like fate very abruptly and not at all subtly intervenes to ensure that a canon event plays out. And it usually comes with a fairly ridiculous explanation. My go-to example of this is always chapter 203, where Luffy is chasing after Crocodile, and realistically, as has absolutely no hope of finding him, but he runs past a suspicious staircase that takes his attention, and he runs down it simply because it looks, and I quote, crocodile-ish. It's like he always rolls a natural 20 at just the right time. Can't find crocodile? Roll perception check. What's that? Natural 20. And then the DM just has to relent and go, okay. You see a hole and it looks crocodile-ish. But I think that meeting Loki is another one of these moments. There is a reason why Luffy needs to be in this place at this time. But as for what happens from here, and also a bit of background as to how we got here, I did receive a comment explaining how Loki's introduction ties into Norse mythology from Gapthrosnir, and I think it's well worth repeating here. In mythology, Loki was bound under the world tree by chains crafted by dwarves. Poison periodically dripped on him, causing him to scream and yell in pain. And that is what caused earthquakes and landslides. The reason for him being chained was also because he caused the death of Balder, by tricking the blind god Hoder into shooting him with the one thing that could harm him. He did this because he was jealous of Balder and what he had, and it's when Loki breaks free of these chains that Ragnarok begins and the end of all 9 worlds come, culminating in Surtur swinging his giant sword of fire in his death throes and reducing the world tree and all of the worlds to ash. So that's pretty cool because it does explain that the big old sword, it's very potentially going to be used to destroy Elbaph. And I think that there's a non-0% chance that Elbaph ends with the complete destruction of the island. Perhaps making the giants refugees and forcing them to become involved in the affairs of the world, perhaps even helping Luffy to enact the dawn of the world, which, if the flooding theory is correct, might even reveal some sort of sacred giant's land that was lost in the flooding long ago. It seems like every arc antagonist height keeps on increasing, so I really tried to restrain myself from talking about this in the last video, because I feel like I've brought it up so often in the past. But look, you're gonna hear it again because it keeps being relevant, and Loki's size is a big thing that points to him being the next major antagonist. To keep Luffy feeling like an underdog despite how stupidly powerful he is, Oda has been purposely scaling his villains up over time. Doflamingo being 2 Luffy's tall, Katakuri was 3 Luffy's tall, Kaido was a whopping 4 Luffy's tall, and now we have Loki, who is at least 5 Luffy's tall, if not Luffy's more. Could be lots more than that, because surprisingly Kaido isn't all that big. He looks big, but only in comparison to Luffy. If you put Kaido next to a giant, he actually looks hilariously small. But we are continuing the height trend here. The higher Luffy's bounty goes, the taller and wider his opponents become. With Loki though, to me, he's the first giant who actually feels like a giant, if you know what I mean. We've met a ton of giants in the series, but they've never felt as threatening as I think a giant should. Dory and Broggy were taken out of action rather sneakily on Little Garden, and Harudin was one shot on Dressrosa. Even the numbers on Wano were pretty disappointing and easily dealt with. Really, the only giant who's ever posed a proper threat at this stage was Oz. But Loki, this Loki is the first standard giant who has made me feel the overwhelming power that a giant should have. Like if I encountered a giant in the wilds of Sydney. And the idea is that Loki, he's not scaled to my power, he's scaled to Luffy's power. This is Luffy, but on a much bigger scale. I said this in the last video, but I need to keep praising this 2-page spread because it's pretty amazing to be able to make Luffy Emperor of the Sea feel so small. Not just in stature, but in power as well. The way the spread is drawn tells me that if a fight were to start right now between Luffy and Loki, then we could be in actual trouble, and instead of doing that, what we should do is turn around and walk, if not run away immediately. In better news though, this revelation of Loki ticks one of our Bing boxes, and we are now threatening a column for Bing, although it does rely on the return of NL happening in the next 5 chapters or so, which I feel is a pretty big and unreasonable ask. I've also spent a lot of time talking about big people in this video, but I do need to give some appreciation to the smallest people, which is Usopp, and in this chapter he is doing his very best to step up. After realizing that he has actually set foot on Elbaph, he is not messing around anymore. He's doing his best to project the bravery he so desires, and in fact the bravery that he feels he needs to even be worthy of existing here. To him, I imagine that this borders on being a religious experience, because Elbaph is very much like a sacred ground that only the worthy are given the privilege of walking, or alternatively, it's like being in a church. Even if you're not religious, if you're in the church, you're still probably going to abide by their rules and customs. And being a brave warrior is the custom of Elbaph, which Usopp is trying his hardest to respect, and I just wanted to give him that recognition because, look, he needs something after the cat incident. But the other Straw Hat I'd like to single out is Nami, because her reaction to Elbaph was by far my favorite. I think it really really says something when the navigator is overwhelmed by distance and scale. Nami is by far the strongest geographical mind within the crew, and even she is pushed to dizziness by the outrageous size of Elbaph. Loki and Haradin being brothers was not what I expected. So this is a massive thing that I skipped over in the last video because Loki himself stole every unit of focus that I had. But this chapter reveals that Haradin is also a prince of Elbaph, and not only that, but we know that he is the eldest prince and rightful heir to the Elbaphian throne, I suppose. Don't quite know how all of that works yet, doesn't matter for now. What matters is that Loki seems to have rather ruined everything by claiming the legendary devil fruit that's supposed to go to the rightful person that inherits the things. But all of this makes Haradin's time on Dressrosa much more compelling and understandable. He traveled to and participated in the Corridor Coliseum to win the Mera no Mi, assumedly attempting to source the most powerful devil fruit he could to combat Loki and protect Elbaph without the inherited legendary fruit. But it may not have just been power that Haradin was after. The Mera no Mi also could have held great thematic importance, because I have made a video on the idea that Ace was a false sun god in the One Piece world, someone that fate built up as a mask for Luffy, because when you look at Ace, everything was pointing in the direction of him being the one to fulfill our Dawn of the World prophecy. And his devil fruit was a huge part of that, because it allows him to conjure light wherever he goes, and even quite literal miniature suns. So assuming that the legendary Elbaph fruit has some connection to this sun godliness, then Haradin may have seen this as the next best option. And in retrospect, Haradin's status seems to be pretty stupidly obvious though, because he came into this story claiming that he would become the king of the giants. But I think that any royal speculation of Haradin was pretty masterfully hidden by Oda, because he showed child Haradin in the village as part of the Big Mom flashback, which, and I guess I can't speak for everyone, but definitely gave me the impression that he was from the less well-off part of society. But I guess this shouldn't be too surprising, because there's a lot of royalty within the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, and indeed within the Straw Hats themselves. Nefertari Vivi, who was brought up in this chapter, but of course we have Vinsmoke Sanji, Prince of the Germa Kingdom. There's also Cavendish, Prince of the Bourgeois Kingdom, and also Sai, who isn't technically royalty of the Kano Kingdom, I guess, but he is the inherited generational leader of their navy. And I suppose this means that Haradin is going to be the Momonosuke of this arc, just hopefully a lot more useful because he's not a child. The road arc also served as an excuse to give the Straw Hats their new Elbaph outfits. I imagine it would be quite hard to find normal human-sized clothing in a giant country. That's very true, actually. Say what you want about Road, however maliciously you want to say it, but you have to admit that this dude has pretty good taste in clothing and a solid future in fashion. I'm even starting to come around to Zara's outfit. I'm still not loving it, but I'm not hating it as much as I did. But this does raise a question for the rest of the crew, which is that when they arrive at Elbaph, how are they going to get their outfits? Maybe after discovering what Road did, he'll be comically browbeaten into dressing the rest of the crew as penance for his hobby crimes, which would also be a good excuse to have an outfit for Robin that's, more on the risque side of the scale, because Road is a pervert. Of course he's gonna dress Robin like that. Don't blame me, Eiichiro Oda, the author. I have no control over these characters that I created. So much stuff mentioned that I don't think anyone realized that Elder Ja Rule is still alive. That's right, Ja Rule is alive and well, having survived his own personal fire festival. In case you don't remember, Ja Rule, I guess just Ja Rule, was one of the Elder Giants in Big Mom's flashback, the Mountain Beard Man, who was a co-captain of the giant warrior pirates with Jorel in an era long before Dory and Broggy. In fact, Jarl is definitely over 400 years old at this point. According to the One Piece timeline, he was born 408 years ago, so I guess that makes him 408. And to put that age into perspective, Jarl was born around the same time that half of Jaya was shot into the sky, and certainly lived on this planet at the same time as both Noland and Kalgara. So he's someone I'm very interested in, because he's one of the rare people on this planet who still has potentially a very strong link to the Void Century, considering that his parents may have, and that his grandparents definitely did, live during the Void Century. So he could have all sorts of second-hand knowledge that's been lost to humanity for like 40 generations now. The Loki we saw in this chapter barely resembled the silhouette we got years ago. Only the curly hair looked the same. So the Loki silhouette happened, and I'm surprised it was this recently actually, but we first saw it 7 years ago. To me, it feels like a lot longer. But the reason why it looks like this is likely because at the time, Oda not only didn't have a specific design in mind, but he also probably hadn't figured out Loki's personality or greater role in the story yet either. I know it's probably blasphemous to say that this wasn't planned out a decade in advance, but that's Oda. And that's why silhouettes very rarely match the eventual character designs. Because it's like Oda Oda, as the author, can see an important character off in the distance, but as the author, they're still so far away that he hasn't met them yet, he doesn't know them. So he visually manifests them as best that he can, which is often vague and quite inaccurate. And I might make a separate video about this at some stage because this is fascinating. But I've recently been made aware that a couple of years ago in Japan, there were very credible industry rumors being spread that we probably wouldn't even be having an Elbaph arc, and that's why Oda's prediction for the end of One Piece was so short during Wano. Because remember, in 2022, Oda said that he was planning on ending One Piece within 3 years, which even if he did skip Elbaph, I don't think would have been possible, because next year is that original end date. But this is something I need to look into a bit more, especially because the reason for Oda's 2-week break was cited as researching and gathering ideas for Elbaph, which makes the whole not part of the original plan idea seem a bit more credible. And from what I've seen so far, these rumors are genuinely quite credible as well. But whatever it turns out to be, I'm incredibly glad that we're here, and I don't remember the last time that I've been more excited to sign a year or two, and even more of my life away to a fictional pirate island. I mean, honestly, you could take as many years as you need, Oda, because I cannot wait to see more from this majestic location. We have a big bounty for the big giant man, an old hairstyle for an old friend who is now on the floor, and this chapter may have subtly revealed exactly how our Shanks became an emperor of the sea. So I feel like after getting through all of the Road of the Sun Goddess stuff, Oda is starting to really shift this story into relentless gear, because we are still in the very opening of this arc, but we are being bombarded with so much. And I've got to say, all of this is heading in a very not good direction. It's all fun and games at the moment, but there is a deep darkness here waiting to be unleashed, and from here things could spiral out of control at an unbelievable rate even for One Piece. But starting with the cover story, it looks like we finally have some Yamato action happening, not because of all the kidnappings, mind you, but because Yasu's sword got stolen. Which, just as a reminder, Yamato was given Yasu's sword by Kinemon so that it can be laid to rest. I say that because every chapter without fail I get comments about Yamato's sword. Some people are only just picking up on it now. And to be fair, it's been a long time since this cover story began, so these things are easily forgotten. This is part 18, and I feel like we might be in for one of, if not the longest cover story in all of One Piece, because Yamato's pilgrimage is supposed to be across all of Wano, and at the moment, we've only covered the flower capital, Kibi, and now Kuri. There is still so much left to be seen and done, and probably a lot more pages of Yamato sitting and eating with assorted people, so we've got a while to go yet. But getting into the actual chapter, we pick up exactly where we left off, and Luffy has now climbed up onto Loki's leg, which is both adorable and blasphemous. We're starting to get to know Loki a bit more, and he definitely has that classical One Piece view of being a god. This is the view that we've seen over and over again in the series, always present in those who present themselves as false deities, which is a particularly rampant attitude among the world nobles, but probably best displayed in Enel, because he's one of the few people who's had the raw power to back up his claims like it looks like Loki does. It's the idea that as a god, my rightful place is above you, which is very much displayed in Loki's whole do not speak without permission first, and silence when I'm talking to you, small rubber man. And the whole idea of Luffy climbing onto Loki reminds me of the tale of Sun Wukong when he urinated on the palm of Buddha. But Oda is setting up an immediate contrast here, because we do have this inevitable clash of sun gods coming. So we're starting to lay out the personal and philosophical differences between Luffy and Loki, but it's not as stark of a contrast as you may think, at least not at the moment, because Luffy and Loki do have some pretty bizarre similarities. For one thing, it was pretty funny that Loki got Luffy's name wrong, because that is the most Luffy-like thing he possibly could have done. Whenever he meets a new person, Luffy can never remember their names. He ends up calling them the wrong thing for a while and then settles for a nickname like how Brûlée became Branch, because it was just easier to remember her based on what she looks like. But from similarities back to contrast, we have the whole idea of Loki being born into a royal family and inheriting the title of king, which is again demonstrated in his godly attitude. This is mine by right, as opposed to what Luffy's doing, which is earning the title of king. Luffy never says, I am the king, it is my right. He says, I will be the pirate king. I will earn it. Because Luffy grew up in a small village in the middle of nowhere, whereas Loki has the infinite resources of Elbaph at his disposal. But then we have another similarity between Luffy and Loki, because I was very intrigued by their brief discussion about freedom. This is a very dangerous thing, it is that Loki says, because I can actually imagine Luffy empathizing with the desire for freedom and agreeing with Loki on a matter of principle. Everyone wants to be free, am I right, Straw Hat? that? You know what? Actually, yeah, Mr. Bad Giant Man, you are right. Let's get right on that freedom for you. Then again, it's not like Luffy's ever been morally bound to free people. There were tons of prisoners in Impel Down who begged him to free them, but he didn't. And even when visiting a slave shop on Sabri Archipelago, Luffy didn't feel an obligation of much of anything, really. He was just disappointed that Kami wasn't there. I do definitely worry about this, though, because I feel like Luffy can be quite easily convinced with words. These semi-logical arguments that Luffy just doesn't have the mental capacity to refute. Or he does, and I think this is more likely to be the Luffy thought process. He does understand that because he may feel that he can free Loki, as if things get out of hand, he'll just smack him back down. That's the kind of confidence that Luffy has in his own abilities. We are seeing that throbbing confidence whipping about all over the chapter, particularly when Luffy immediately bonds with all of the fearsome beasts. And something I love here is that Luffy has such a warm feeling whilst doing this because it's not outright stated, but he's having a nostalgic flashback to the animal friends that he made training for 2 years on Rusukaina. And as he should, because this is a weird fact, Luffy has spent about 4 times as much time with those animals than he has with the Straw Hats. Those animals are much closer friends than the members of the crew. But if anyone's capable of tricking Luffy into doing something that will, very potentially cause the end of the world here, then it would be the character inspired by a Norse trickster god. Although weirdly enough, I'm actually getting some flashbacks to Blackbeard on Jaya here, because Luffy is usually capable of picking up on the bad vibes of a major antagonist pretty instantly, but there are definitely some rare cases where an antagonist will completely fly under his radar, much like how Blackbeard did at first before they had a difference in opinion over Cherry Pie. And with Blackbeard, that's because he's not a complete antithesis to Luffy. They have stark differences, as physically represented with the sun god and the darkness blob, whatever Blackbeard is. But in terms of dreams, belief, and ambition, they are scarily similar. And I have that same feeling with Loki at the moment, which gives me some fictional pirate chills. Because if Loki does turn out to be the villain that we're being led to believe he is, then he's very much more on the Blackbeard side of the antagonistic spectrum. Someone to take very seriously, and he would have to be, because at this stage for a character to be worthy of holding the title of arc antagonist, then they need to be able to top what we've seen to this point. They need to be able to top what the 5 Elder Stars and what Kaido could do, and I think seriously ideologically challenge Luffy and set him up for the final clash with Blackbeard. But Luffy also gets what the internet would describe as triggered in this chapter, when Loki starts smack-talking Shanks, and I'm kind of surprised at how immediately violent Luffy got. It was straight into a full gear forth into the face. This wasn't a warning shot. Loki had to dodge the attack, which I do think is a bit of an overreaction and very much against the philosophy set up all the way back in chapter 1 of One Piece, where Shanks really didn't mind being disrespected and being made a fool of so long as his friends weren't threatened. So it was really cool to see because we very rarely see that super serious Luffy these days. Gear 5th has kind of taken a lot of that away, but it does feel unusually trigger happy for Luffy. And I wonder if this is setting up how Loki may break free, and I really hope this isn't the case, but maybe Loki could annoy Luffy to the point where Luffy relentlessly attacks him, and Luffy's attacks, man, they're quite powersome, perhaps strong enough to break a chain or a piece of tree or something. And again, I hope not, but this does feel a little bit out of character for Luffy. Shanks has been insulted right in front of his face before, and Luffy has never gotten this worked up about it, so maybe there's a greater purpose to what's happening here. Speaking of Mr. Shanks though, what I find most interesting about this section is that Loki says that he's been chained up for 6 years. And 6 years ago was a very interesting time for the One Piece world, because 3 incredibly important events happened. The first is that Robin joined Baroque Works to assist Crocodile in finding Pluton. The second is that Frankie returned to Water 7 and received the blueprints for Pluton. Lots of ancient weapon stuff, specifically Pluton. But the third and by far most public of events is that 6 years ago is when Shanks officially became an Emperor of the Sea. And given that Shanks has a clear history with Loki and that the world government are aware of and fear Loki enough to slap him with a bounty of 2.6 billion berries, maybe it was Shanks who defeated or otherwise incapacitated Loki, which prompted the world government to consider him a threat on the level of a Whitebeard, a Big Mama, or a Kaido. But also this timeline very much fits with what we know of Lola as well, because we've never been told exactly how long ago it was that Lola rejected Loki's marriage proposal, but what we do know is that Lola arrived on Thriller Bark 5 years ago, had her shadow stolen by Gecko Moria, and then spent 3 years warriors trying to get it back before the Straw Hats arrived and greatly assisted in their quest. I can see it taking Lola a year to travel from the New World and ending up in the Grand Line, so it's feeling like 6 years ago could have been the catalyst for everything we're seeing here. Very important year for the world, where Loki proposed to Lola and she refused, which caused her to set out on her own journey. And this rejection may even have triggered Loki's desire to end the world, which resulted in him being captured and imprisoned by Shanks, resulted in him being labeled as an Emperor of the Sea. I don't know though, I swear if Loki's whole reason for wanting to destroy the world is because he got rejected by a woman, I mean not just any woman, in his eyes it's the woman, but still, I don't know, I'm hoping there's a bit more to it than that. With what we know at the moment though, the Loki we have seen was a lovely, smiley man pre-Lola and became an instrument of the apocalypse post-Lola. And it could very well be the case that Charlotte Lola has been one of the single most important decision makers in One Piece history. Because if she married Loki and the Elbaph giants formed an alliance with the Big Mom pirates, then it would be similar to the alliance that Big Mom made with Kaido, if not more devastating, because the extended armies of the giants are feared much more than the Beast Pirates, and Loki himself is being presented as an individual equitable to other emperors of the sea. We even see this expressed in numerical form. As mentioned before, Loki is an insane 2.6 billion berries. So the world government at least sees this guy as an emperor level threat. And I honestly didn't think that Loki would have a bounty, just given how isolated Elbaph is. In terms of bounty rankings, we're 2 chapters into his existence, but Loki currently has the 11th highest bounty in all of One Piece. Although I should note that 10th place is currently shared by 7 characters who each have a 3 billion berry bounty. Luffy, Kid, Laurel of the Admirals, and the Garp. You almost never see a character in the 2 billion berry range though. We often skip straight from 1 billion to 3 or 4 billion, and the only other character who's ever had a 2 billion berry bounty was Blackbeard after he became an Emperor of the Sea, and even back then his bounty was lower than Loki's. It isn't anymore, Blackbeard's worth almost 4 billion now. But to think that there was a point in very recent history, we're talking Act 1 of Wano recent history, where the world government feared Loki more than Blackbeard. To think that that was a thing is very exciting. Of course, my question is, even if someone were to defeat and turn Loki in, where would the world government possibly plan on imprisoning him? I think that where he is right now may be the only place on this planet possible of containing him. And to explain why, we should definitely talk about this grand tree itself. It was pretty stunning to have this confirmed, but the tree that Loki is bound to is the treasure tree Adam. Because the idea that this Yggdrasil tree was Adam has existed for a long time, at least since 2006 when the tree was first mentioned. So it feels incredibly surreal to finally have it confirmed after almost 2 decades. And just as a refresher, the One Piece world contains 2 legendary Genesis trees. We have the Sunlight Tree Eve, which we've never fully seen, but it's the roots of this tree that provides sunlight to Fishman Island, and the Treasure Tree Adam, which is also known as the Jewel Tree in the official English translation, which Frankie has referred to as the strongest tree in the world. Bit of tree power scaling there, but Frankie has mentioned that there are several of these sorts of trees, but Adam and Eve seem to be these grand trees that practically gave life to large sections of this planet. And actually, in that same chapter, chapter 431, Frankie practically confirms that Adam was on Elbaph, because he described its location as a faraway, war-torn island where people perpetually fight wars, but no matter whether they all die and all of their buildings turn into ruins, this tree always remains. So Adam, in addition to its size, is the perfect location for Elbaph, because it's the one place powerful enough that it cannot be destroyed by even the most devastating of wars. And it's also the most logical place on the planet for endless wars to take place, because the resources that this tree provides are unlike anything else you can find on this planet. And it's also the only structure strong enough to actually contain someone like Loki. The sea stone chains do take away his fruit powers and weaken the fruit users slightly, but if this was a simple tree, then Loki would have no worries breaking through that bad boy. I guarantee that this tree is more secure than all of Impel Down, which, come to think of it, also had a general theme of the underworld. But there are currently 2 pirate ships in the world that have been constructed out of Adam wood, one of which was the Ora Jackson Goldie Rogers vessel, and the other of which is our very own Thousand Sunny, because Frankie used the 200 million berries he stole to buy Adam wood on the black market. So all I'm gonna say is, if there was an arc where the Thousand Sunny maybe got a bit of an upgrade, then maybe, Egghead, not the right arc after all, because we have the strongest materials that we will ever find on this planet right here. And in a way, this is like a homecoming for the Thousand Sunny, as this is essentially where the Thousand Sunny was born. But another surprise in this chapter came in the form of Nico Robin deciding to go very retro on us and reclaim her pre-time skip hairstyle. This is a big deal. But as for why Brooke was the one cutting Robin's hair, there is some logic here, because we do surprisingly have extensive knowledge knowledge of Straw Hat hairdressing lore. Originally, it was stated by Oda that Robin and Usopp were the ones responsible for crew haircuts, but Usopp's not here and Robin is the one in need of a haircut. And later on, it was also established that Sanji sometimes covers hairdressing needs, but again, he's not here. And so we turn to Brook, a man without eyes, to do the cutting of the hair. But I think it makes a lot of sense because his afro shows a great level of care for his hair, and Brook's also a skilled swordsman, so he'd probably be a lot more precise than Frankie or Jinbei. Although then again, Frankie is not to be underestimated when it comes to hair. He may actually be the most competent hairdresser on the crew. I mean, the dude has turned his hair into both a cannon and a whale, so I'd probably trust him with a fringe. Let's talk about the fringe, specifically why the fringe, because this is, it is ridiculously sweet. As Robin is now anticipating a reunion with Soul, she's going back to the hairstyle that she had as a child, perhaps with a thought that Soul wouldn't recognize her with new hair. And I really like it. Robin is one of the characters who I prefer the pre-time skip look for, hair and everything. And my one wish is that we can now go all the way back and give her a nice cowboy hat as well. Really returning Robin to that Indiana Jones style archaeologist. But because Robin can't have anything nice ever, this chapter ends in the worst possible way with the news that Jaguar D Soul has fallen and cannot get up. Or something along those lines. Ill fortune has fallen upon him, causing Soul himself to fall. And I don't like it. I swear, if this Robin Soul reunion doesn't happen, I will riot, or I will still riot to a lesser degree if this is a situation where Robin only gets to speak to Soul for a few minutes on his deathbed or on his death floor before departing this world and ripping my heart out and tearing it to pieces for a second time. My only solace at the moment is that I don't think Oda would do that. It feels a bit miserable for his writing style outside of flashbacks. So here's what I'm thinking. Soul has fallen unconscious in order to keep him out of the story for a bit. There's something that he knows that we can't have Robin or the Straw Hats finding out about yet because it's not the correct dramatic moment, and Oda needs to find an excuse to stop them communicating. That would be my best guess. I don't think that anything truly horrible is going to happen to Soul at this stage, but I could also be very wrong. Given what Oda did to Bartholomew Kuma, nothing is off the table with beloved father figures of our female cast, but feel free to drop your questions, statements, and theories about this chapter in the comments below. I'm a bit confused by the wording special bounty. Look, that's fair enough because Loki's special bounty is not actually explained in this chapter, and I believe this is the first time that a special bounty has been mentioned in One Piece. And one reason for said speciality could be that Loki simply isn't a criminal. Bounties are generally assigned to pirates, revolutionaries, bandits, and other ne'er-do-wells, but I do think you might have to have some unique reasoning to issue a bounty on a foreign prince who hasn't done anything that the world government could consider criminal. Even Nika Robin, an 8-year-old girl, you could maybe consider her bounty special, but even she committed a crime in the eyes of the world government, which was to learn the ancient language and threaten to uncover the history of the Void Century. So with Loki, maybe it has to do with his devil fruit, a very special bounty for a very special fruit. Let's say that it really is the sun god fruit, or at the very least the world government believes it's the sun god fruit. They think that this is the Nika fruit before they discovered that Luffy had it, so that would be a pretty big cause to issue a special bounty. And I did also see it suggested in the comments that the special nature of this bounty could be a case where the world government pays someone to manage or contain Loki, or it was bounty not even issued by the world government. As in perhaps Loki was on some sort of rampage and Elbaph itself said to the world, hey everyone, we'll pay 2.6 billion berries to whoever subdues this troublemaker, and then enter Redhead Shanks, who's all like, mate, that's a lot of drinking money. So Shanks defeats Loki, collects a sweet payout so that he doesn't have to use because he also gets free bar privileges on Elbaph for life. And when the world hears about this, they realize just how much of a true danger Shanks is, and he becomes anointed as an Emperor of the Sea. So this is a bit out there, but maybe Loki was the former Emperor of the Sea before Shanks? As in the idea of Loki marrying Lola was more like a formalized alliance between the original emperors? Because someone must have existed before Shanks, right? The Seven Warlords, for example, have subbed people in and out for decades now, so I find it hard to believe that the 4 emperors were always the 4 that we were first introduced to. Just because Shanks is so young in comparison to Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido, and he became an emperor so comparatively recently. There's definitely a rich history here with other potential emperors who held the title before Shanks. So maybe it was originally the 3 emperors and Shanks just kind of forced his way in there like Luffy almost did by becoming the 5th emperor. Or maybe the original 4th emperor was another member of the Rocks Pirates. Because you may or may not have noticed this in the chapter, but there is a pretty blatant Rocks Pirates reference, which is that a lot of the animals that we see in this chapter around Loki and the one killed by Haradin, etc. are reused designs from One Piece Strong World, which was the first One Piece film written by Eiichiro Oda, and it featured Golden Lion Shiki as its main antagonist. So Shiki has always been of questionable canon. He does exist, but the events of Strong World do not accept that they almost did, because at the end of Chapter 0, Shiki does begin his plan of cultivating these large creatures to destroy East Blue with the intention that he's gonna let them all loose in 20 years' time, which didn't happen. Assumedly Shiki was stopped by someone not Luffy, someone in the actual series canon, and maybe that someone was Shanks, who has, a bit of a vested interest in protecting East Blue, because that's where the Luffy was. And if that was the case, then after being defeated, all of Shiki's monstrous animals that he's grown for decades would need to go somewhere, and being familiar with Elbaph, maybe that's where Shanks took them all. The only place that they could possibly exist. Remembering that these animals were trained for battle, so being on Warland is a natural home for them. And it would wrap up Chapter 0 very neatly, as well as draw a very stark line between what is and isn't canon with Shiki. Loki has a hammer. How did anyone miss this? Loki does indeed have a hammer, which I love. In the wide shot of Loki chained up, you can see that there is a colossal Mjolnir-style hammer casually sitting behind him, and at first I thought, ooh, that's a dangerous choice, to allow the prisoner to keep his weapon of mass destruction. And I guess it probably makes sense. Maybe there's no one physically strong enough on Elbaph to lift the hammer, or if we're going full Mjolnir, then there's no one on Elbaph who is deemed worthy, so they just have to keep the hammer with him. And hey, maybe this opens up an opportunity for Luffy to lift the hammer and be deemed worthy. To me, Loki feels like a good guy trying to act like the villain. I'd actually be on board with that if it wasn't for that one thought bubble that we got from Loki in this chapter. The one where he's telling himself, oh my god, I'm gonna kill this rubber. If I get out of these restraints, he's dead. If it wasn't for that, I'd be more willing to believe that maybe this is all an act and perhaps there's some tragic backstory that's gonna come up and recontextualize everything and break our Loki hearts. But right now, the dude seems pretty villainous. Now we know why sea stone was labeled as rare material, because 99% of it is used for Loki's chains. Yeah, it's actually insane. The sheer quantity of sea stone present in this one panel. Because remember, these chains wrap around the entire treasure tree atom. Even what we're seeing of them right now is a pitiful representation of how much there is in fictional reality. And I have seen some people suggest that Loki is just cuffed with sea stone and the chains are regular, but I don't think so, because we have seen something like this before on Wano when Queen restrained Big Mom. He stated that both the handcuffs and the chains were made of sea stone, and to wrap it around her 100 times and to give her a sedative, because that is the only way that the power of an emperor could possibly be contained. So what we've got here is that binding power times 1,000, or some sort of similarly large number, because I really don't think that cuffs alone would be enough to subdue Loki. They weren't enough for Big Mom, they're not going to be enough for him. But sea stone is such an incredibly rare substance because it originates from Wano, which is an isolated island that doesn't engage in trade with the rest of the world, so the sea stone that made it off Wano originally is all the world currently has access to. And you've really got to wonder what constituted the need for these chains in the first place, because it wasn't Loki. These chains must have predated Loki, so they may have been commissioned during the Void Century or even before, to hold some other nefariously powerful giant with a devil fruit ability, because that's the only reason why you need this specific substance. Here's an idea though. Our man Monkey D. Luffy, he's all about the freedom, can't get enough of the liberation, and if we can end this arc without needing to chain Loki or someone else back, then maybe this material could be put to use for something much more fun. For example, we have both Frankie and Lilith available to turn the supply of sea stone into any number of funky weapons or useful defenses, which would be pretty amazing if you were going up against a crew in the future who just so happened to have bet the house on devil fruit abilities and have spent the last year or two deliberately hunting for the most powerful ones. What we're seeing right here could be a full counter to the Blackbeard pirates. And if not used for that, then, well, opportunity missed. Seems Soul finally met the most dangerous foe in all of One Piece. He fell into the trap of down D stairs. Oh dear, you know what? It actually does sound startlingly similar to how Kuina died. It's Kuina. Oh no, she's fallen down and cannot get back up. And look, you've got to remember that this isn't your basic East Blue down D stairs. Nah, mate. This is New World Elbaph down D stairs. This is a whole new level, or I guess because we're talking about stairs, this is a whole new floor. And not at all an opponent to be taken lightly. Soul is gonna wake up right on time for the obligatory party at the end of the arc. So I think he'll probably wake up before that, because what's happening here feels like a very standard Oda device, where the reasonable person with important information needs to be removed so that exciting complications can happen. We had a similar situation on Fishman Island when we first arrived expecting to see Jinbei, and he just, well, he wasn't there. So we spent the introduction of the arc creating all sorts of fun complications, and then about halfway through, Jinbei arrived to clear everything up and straighten us out so that we all knew what we were were doing in the final fights. And you know what? Jinbei actually did the same thing on Whole Cake Island. We arrived, we didn't find him, he was there, we saw him, Straw Hats didn't, but he came in halfway through to sort things out, free Luffy from prison, form an alliance, etc. And I also feel like there's a chance that Oda could tease this reunion even more by having Saul wake up and encountering a different Straw Hat, or even Straw Hats plural that aren't Robin, and saving that moment of meeting Robin for the very end. Sort of like how he kept Kinemon and Suru apart on Wano until the celebration, and also Momonosuke and Hiyori. Wano lasted for 4 years and they didn't get to see each other until the last handful of chapters. And that's because Oda loves these cathartic reunions when everyone gets to let go and cry from their noses because nothing else is there to immediately worry about. So maybe we're gonna need to be just a little bit more patient with Robin and Saul. Mad Lad take, the silhouette Loki is in fact what he looked like 6 years ago, but after he got rejected, he went full Sigma grind set and hit the gym like it owed him money. I mean, hey, the whole wanting to destroy the world thing aside, this isn't the worst response. Loki gets rejected and then decides, you know what guys, I'm gonna go work on myself. And something definitely went wrong, actually very wrong along the way, but I don't mind the general idea. And maybe Elbaph is just currently facing a bit of a men's crisis. Because funnily enough, we have already seen Road, who definitely represents more of the incel stereotype. And I think if there is an island to truly explore what masculinity is, it has got to be the land of warriors. I think that the fact that Loki's bounty was immediately revealed to be lower than Luffy's soft confirms that either A, he won't be the major arc antagonist, or B, Elbaph will be a shorter arc without the increasingly grand climaxes we're used to. He seems to have too much other stuff going on to play the trickster mastermind role that would make up for the strength deficit. So I'm not sure about that last part. I think that we've barely scratched the surface with Loki, but I will say that it is extremely rare that Luffy finds himself in a position against a properly serious antagonist with a lower bounty than his. These sorts of encounters are usually reserved for statement fights like Luffy versus Bellamy, or complete jokes like Luffy versus Foxy on Long Ring Longland, or I guess for the Warlords, if only because their bounties were frozen. On Dressrosa, for example, Luffy did technically have a higher bounty than Doflamingo. So the lower number, it is interesting, because if Oda was doing his usual thing of making Luffy the underdog, then really you'd want Loki to be at least at 3 billion mark, if not a tiny bit higher. Not to say that bounties are a direct form of power scaling, they absolutely are never, not that what don't do that, but when making his story, Oda likes to stack the elements against Luffy as much as possible to always keep it feeling like he's the underdog. So I am very curious to see where this goes for Luffy, and if this is a case where he has to actually defend his status from an underdog standing over him for the first time in the One Piece. Man on the internet, you forgot about Loki's proposal to defeat any pirate crew if Luffy liberated him. Classic Oda's Chekhov gun example. I wonder what he'll do with it. So look, I'm trying to be a bit more careful with Chekhov lately, which is something that I wish more amateur theater societies did when they chose to produce his plays. But sometimes Oda does set up stuff like this without the intent of paying anything off in the future, and the example I'm going to use here are the photon gloves from Egghead Island. We took time out of our fictional pirate day to focus on these gloves and exactly how they functioned, but they never came into play, which is wild because they would have been the perfect weapon to fight against a man made of light. Some people think that Sanji's boots had these special properties as well because he blocked Kizaru's attack, but the boots don't have the photon function. That was just Sanji being amazing. He does that sometimes, and we've got to give him that credit when he does. So when Loki says that he'll destroy any pirate crew, what I do love is that Luffy doesn't dismiss the idea. He casually takes it in whilst relaxing in the brisk winds of the underworld. And isn't it fascinating that Loki specifically mentions a pirate crew, not an individual, not an organization. It has to be a pirate crew. And I guess that's because Luffy claims that he was going to become the pirate king, and Loki's trying to play into assisting that desire. Although I can't imagine Luffy ever taking him up on that because he's more the guy to want to do things himself, such as crushing all the dreams of his rivals. And even if Luffy did take him up on the offer, who is left to choose? Luffy's not going to stick Loki on Shanks, and as hilarious as it would be, I can't see him choosing Cross-Guild either. And really after that point, the only pirate crew we're left with is Blackbeard. So I don't know if it's going to be relevant, but if it is, it's a pretty decent setup for why we're going to free Loki. Let's say a pirate problem emerges that we have to take care of immediately, and Luffy's incapacitated somehow, Zoro's incapacitated somehow, Sanji's incapacitated somehow, Jinbei's incapacitated somehow, and we go down the line until we have no more Straw Hats left. Then it might be seen as a decent idea to free Loki and ask him to fulfill his offer. You should continue your villain tier Lizzle. Love that format and the deep dive of the villains of the One Piece universe. Hope to see more soon. You will see more soon, because I am indeed continuing my continue. And the next one is going to be on Kizaru coming out next week, but there's a whole playlist on this channel for the villain tier list, which is where we're going going through every major antagonist in One Piece video by video and deciding how they stack up in their narrative roles. And one day we may even end up covering Loki, but that feels like it might be potentially a year or two down the line. But if you're looking for something to watch next, then absolutely highly recommended, good stuff there.